They say the strongest wolves never break. They're wrong. I watched an alpha king shatter the night he rejected his fated mate in front of thousands. Not because he was weak, because he was terrified of becoming human. This is the story of Lucien Drakar, the man who conquered empires but couldn't survive his own heart. Stay until the end, because what happens when that bond starts rotting inside him will rip your soul apart. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments so I know my pack is listening. The throne room of Raventhorn Palace stretched like a cathedral built for executions. Obsidian walls rose toward vaulted ceilings that disappeared into shadow, their surfaces carved with scenes of conquest and submission. Torches burned in iron sconces, flames casting restless shadows across the faces of 1,000 witnesses packed shoulder to shoulder on the black marble floor. The air tasted like winter and old blood, thick with the musk of powerful wolves and the sharper scent of anticipation. Something historic was about to happen. They were right about that, just not in the way they expected. Alpha King Lucien Drakar stood on the raised dais before his throne, a monument of controlled violence wrapped in ceremonial black armor. 30 years old and already legend. The Wolf King, who'd burned 3 rival territories into submission before most men learned to lead a hunt. Dark hair swept back from a face that might have been handsome if it wasn't so relentlessly cold. Eyes like storm clouds before lightning strikes, jaw carved from the same volcanic stone as his palace. Everything about him screamed dominance, everything except the silver mark beginning to glow on his left wrist. The moon goddess had made her choice. General Veilor stood to Lucien's right, close enough to see the muscle jumping in his king's jaw. The old warrior had fought beside Lucien's father and survived long enough to serve the sun, survived wars that killed stronger men, survived political purges that erased entire bloodlines. He knew that particular tension in his king's shoulders. It was the same rigidity that appeared before Lucien ordered cities burned and populations relocated. The girl stood in the center of the throne room. Seraphina Vale, 23 years old. Slender, but not fragile in the way weapons are slender. Silver eyes that reflected torchlight like polished mirrors. Dark hair falling past her shoulders in waves that hadn't seen a royal stylist or expensive oils. She wore a simple gray dress, the kind battlefield healers wore when working in field hospitals where blood and mud made expensive fabric pointless. Not a princess. Not a noble daughter bred for political marriages. A lowborn wolf raised among the forgotten soldiers and camp followers who kept armies alive while kings claimed glory. The silver bond mark glowed against her throat like a brand, like a death sentence. The court stared in collective shock that rippled outward from the center like waves from a stone dropped in still water, 1,000 wolves holding their breath. Duke Malachar whispered something to the countess beside him. The sound carried in the massive chamber, laughter, barely concealed. Other nobles joined in, their voices building like a swarm of locusts descending on a harvest. A healer. The moon goddess had paired the most powerful alpha in 3 kingdoms with a girl who smelled like medicine and poverty. Seraphina stood perfectly still beneath the weight of 1,000 staring eyes. Her hands hung at her sides, not clenched, not trembling. Her spine straight, chin level. She didn't tremble, didn't cry, didn't drop her gaze to the floor like every instinct of pack hierarchy demanded. She just looked at Luce with an expression that would haunt him for the rest of his miserable life. Hope. Pure, terrible, devastating hope. The bond thrummed between them like a living wire stretched too tight. Lucien felt it in his chest, his bones, the base of his skull where the wolf lived. A physical thing trying to pull him forward. His wolf surged against his control with violent hunger, demanding he cross that space and claim what the goddess had offered. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to take her, to drag her onto that throne and make the entire empire witness their binding. His hands shook. He clenched them behind his back where no one could see. Because Lucien had spent his entire life learning to strangle instinct, to bury desire beneath duty, to kill every soft thing inside himself until nothing remained but iron will and calculated violence. His father had taught him that lesson in the cruelest way possible. Love makes kings weak. The previous Alpha King had loved Lucien's mother with the kind of obsession that poets celebrated and historians condemned. She'd been beautiful and kind and entirely unsuited for the brutality of imperial politics. When she died, giving birth to Lucien's stillborn sister, his father descended into madness so complete it became the cautionary tale every young king learned. Started wars over imagined insults. Executed advisors for looking at him wrong. Burned villages because their harvests reminded him of her favorite flowers. Drove the empire to the edge of collapse because half his soul was in the ground, and the other half was destroying everything she would have protected. Young Lucien had watched it happen. Had seen firsthand what happened when emotion infected the throne. When love became the crack that shattered an entire kingdom. When Lucien finally took the crown at age 22, after his father's own generals quietly arranged a hunting accident that looked just convincing enough, he made himself a promise written in blood and sealed with fire. Never again. No distractions. No vulnerabilities. No mate bond that could crack him open and turn him into the monster his father became. The throne was everything. The empire was everything. Nothing else could matter. The throne room waited. 1,000 wolves watching their king face the moon goddess's will, watching to see if he would accept this gift or commit an act so unprecedented it would echo through history. Seraphina took one small step forward. Just one. Her voice came out steady despite the entire court watching her humiliation unfold in real time. Your Majesty. 2 words. That's all. But Lucien heard the question buried inside them, heard the hope she was trying so hard to contain. The bond pulled at him like fishhooks in his sternum, trying to drag him forward. His wolf clawed at his ribs from the inside, snarling and feral and demanding he stop being such a goddamned coward. Every rational thought in his head screamed at him to pause, to think, to consider what he was about to destroy. But rationality was exactly what kept him on the throne. Rationality was what separated him from his father. So he spoke clearly, loud enough for every noble, every servant, every witness packed into that obsidian cathedral to hear. I reject this bond. The throne room went silent. Not the quiet of respect, the silence of shock. Of hundreds of wolves collectively holding their breath because they couldn't believe what they'd just heard, couldn't process it. The moon goddess's will wasn't a suggestion. It was divine law, sacred, unbreakable. Rejecting a fated mate was unprecedented, unthinkable, insane. Seraphina's face didn't change, but something behind her eyes flickered and died like a candle flame going out. The silver mark on her throat pulsed once, brightly, like a heart trying to restart after stopping. Then it began to fade. The physical manifestation of a bond being murdered before it could fully form. Lucien forced himself to continue, made his voice harder, crueler. Because cruelty was the only language the noble houses understood, the only way to make this stick. If he showed even a moment of hesitation, even a flicker of regret, they would tear him apart like wolves on wounded prey. The empire requires strength, not sentiment. This bond is a distraction I will not entertain. He watched her absorb each word like physical blows, watched her hands finally clench at her sides, watched her throat move as she swallowed. Still, she didn't break. You are dismissed from court, permanently. Duke Malachar laughed outright now. The sound carried across the marble floor like breaking glass. Other nobles joined him, their laughter building. Not because it was funny, because laughter was how predators tested whether their alpha was strong enough to keep them in line. This moment would define Lucien's reign. Show weakness here, show mercy, and the noble houses would smell blood in the water. So Lucien did what he always did when backed into a corner. He doubled down. General Vialor, escort the girl from the palace. She is no longer welcome within Raventhorn's walls. The old general hesitated, just for a heartbeat. Just long enough for Lucien to see the disappointment flash across his weathered face. Then Vialor moved forward, his expression carefully blank. But Seraphina turned before the general could reach her. She walked toward the massive doors at the far end of the throne room, every step measured, deliberate, spine straight, head high, like a queen walking toward execution with dignity and tact. The crowd parted like water around a stone, nobles stepping back to let her pass. Some pitied her. Most were already calculating how to use this moment for political advantage, and Lucien stood on his dais and watched her go. His wolf thrashed inside him like a caged animal, trying to tear through his ribs. The bond mark on his wrist burned even as it faded to a thin silver scar. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to stop her, to call her back, to fall to his knees and beg forgiveness for this unforgivable thing. But Lucien Drakar hadn't built an empire by listening to instinct. He'd built it by crushing every weakness until nothing remained but iron will and the kind of violence that made other kings kneel. The doors closed behind her with a sound like a coffin ceiling. Thunder rolled across distant mountains. The throne room erupted in conversation. Nobles clustered in groups, already spinning narratives, already rewriting history to favor their own positions. The king had rejected his mate. The king had put empire above emotion. The king had proven himself strong enough to defy even the moon goddess herself. Lucien turned and sat down on his throne. The cold volcanic stone pressed against his back. He waited for the relief to come. It didn't. Also. 3 nights later, Seraphina disappeared from the kingdom without a trace. The healer's quarters in the lower city stood empty when the morning shift arrived. Her few belongings, some clothes, medical supplies, a journal filled with careful notes about treating battlefield wounds, abandoned. The guards at the northern gate reported seeing a small figure in a traveling cloak leave just before dawn. Hood pulled low, face hidden. No one stopped her. Why would they? She was nobody. Lucien heard the news during a council meeting about grain taxes and territorial redistribution. Duke Malachar was droning on about crop yields when General Vale entered and whispered something in the king's ear. "The healer is gone, Your Majesty. Left the city before dawn." Lucien felt nothing. That was a lie. He felt relief. That was also a lie. What he actually felt was a gnawing emptiness where the bond had been, like missing a tooth, and constantly probing the gap with his tongue. But he categorized that feeling as temporary discomfort, physical withdrawal. The human body was resilient, the wolf spirit even more so. This phantom pain would fade within weeks. He was catastrophically wrong. The nightmare started on the 4th night. Lucien woke in his chambers drenched in sweat, heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape. He'd been dreaming of Silver Eyes watching him from across a frozen wasteland. In the dream, he'd been calling for her, screaming her name until his throat bled and his voice gave out. But she just kept walking away, getting smaller and smaller until she vanished into a snowstorm that swallowed everything. He stood from his bed on legs that shook, crossed to the window. Raventhorn Palace sprawled beneath him, a monument of black stone and imperial power. Torches burned throughout the grounds like earthbound stars. Guards patrolled the walls in perfect formations, everything in immaculate order, everything exactly as it should be. So why did his chest feel like someone had carved out his lungs with a rusty blade and left the cavity to fill with ice water? He slept 2 hours that night. The next night, 3. By the end of the first week, Lucien couldn't remember the last time he'd slept through until morning. The dreams came every time he closed his eyes. Sometimes he saw her broken on the ground, throat torn out by wolves. Sometimes she was burning in a fire he couldn't reach through. Sometimes she just stood in that throne room, staring at him with that terrible hope dying in her eyes over and over and over. His wolf grew restless, then aggressive, then violent. 2 weeks after the rejection, Lucien nearly killed a servant who spilled wine near the throne. Just a splash. A few drops on the marble. The kind of minor accident that happened a dozen times a day in any palace. Lucien was halfway across the dais, claws extended, murder in his eyes before General Vale's iron grip on his shoulder shocked him back to something resembling rationality. The servant fled, dropped the wine pitcher, and ran like prey being chased. The council members present exchanged carefully blank looks, the kind of looks that said they were witnessing something dangerous, something wrong. Later that night, Vale found Lucien in the palace armory, methodically destroying practice dummies with his bare hands. Wood and straw exploded across the training floor, splinters embedded in his knuckles, blood dripping from torn skin that healed almost as fast as it split. The old general watched his king shred another dummy into kindling before speaking. "You're losing control." Lucien drove his fist through a support post. The entire weapons rack shuddered. Swords rattled in their mounts. "I'm fine. You're not sleeping. Your eyes are bloodshot. Yesterday you executed a baker for burning bread." He was wasteful. He was nervous because you were standing 3 feet away, radiating murder like a furnace radiates heat. Lucien turned, His eyes flashed gold in the torchlight, the wolf rising too close to the surface, too close to taking over completely. What would you have me do, Valor? Track her down? Beg her to come back? Prove to every noble house in the empire that their king is weak enough to regret his own decisions? The general crossed his arms. Old scars covered his forearms like pale rivers cutting through tanned leather. Battle scars. Survival scars. The kind you earn by living long enough to make mistakes and learn from them. I would have you consider that strength and stubbornness are not the same thing. They are when you wear a crown. Your father believed that too. The comparison hit like a slap. Lucien's hands clenched into fists. Blood dripped onto the stone floor. His voice dropped to something dangerous, something lethal. I am nothing like my father. No, Valor agreed quietly. Your father never rejected his mate. He just let loving her destroy him. You're trying a different path to the same destination. Lucien stared at the old warrior, the man who'd taught him to fight, who'd served loyally through every brutal campaign, who'd never once questioned an order in 20 years of service. Until now. Get out. Valor didn't move. Get out. The general left. Lucien stood alone in the ruined armory, surrounded by shredded practice dummies and his own ragged breathing. His wrist throbbed where the bond mark had faded to a thin silver scar that still caught the light sometimes, still pulsed with phantom sensation when he wasn't paying attention. He told himself it was phantom pain, just temporary withdrawal symptoms, just his body adjusting to the absence of something it had barely started to feel. But deep down, in the parts of himself he never examined because examining them would require admitting they existed, Lucien knew the truth. The bond wasn't breaking cleanly. It was rotting inside him like infected meat. 1 month after the rejection, the Empire began noticing changes in their king. Public executions increased. Minor offenses drew major punishments. A merchant caught using false weights lost both hands. A nobleman who spoke against imperial grain taxes lost his title, his lands, and his eldest son to a labor camp. A young soldier who fell asleep on watch lost his life dangling from the palace gates as a warning to others. The court learned to approach the throne with the kind of caution usually reserved for wild animals and unstable explosives. Because Alpha King Lucien Drakar was becoming unpredictable. His council meetings devolved into shouting matches where advisors spoke in whispers and flinched at sudden movements. His war strategies grew needlessly aggressive, proposing invasions of territories that posed no threat. When Duke Malachar suggested diplomatic negotiations with the eastern territories, Lucien called him a coward in front of the entire court. "Your father negotiated," the king snarled. "Look where that got him." The duke's face went purple with rage, but he said nothing, because everyone could see it. The king was unraveling. Late at night, servants whispered that they heard the king pacing his chambers, that sometimes he stood at his window for hours, staring toward the northern mountains where some said the rejected mate had fled, that his rooms always smelled like lavender and snow, even though no flowers grew in the volcanic soil around Raventhorn and snow never reached the lower elevations. The bond was haunting him, and Lucien was too proud to admit it. During a state dinner celebrating another conquered village, this one burned for refusing to increase their grain tribute, Lucien sat at the head of a table loaded with roasted game and imported wine. Nobles laughed and congratulated each other. Musicians played. Dancers performed elaborate routines. The entire scene made Lucien want to burn it all down and salt the earth afterward. He forced himself to drink, to smile at the correct moments, to nod when Duke Malachar toasted to imperial strength and the king's unwavering resolve. But all he could think about was how empty the celebration felt, how hollow victory tasted when you had no one to share it with except sycophants who would sell you to your enemies for a better position at someone else's table. He remembered his father hosting feasts like this after his mother died. Remembered watching the old king sit at the head of an identical table, surrounded by identical excess, looking like the loneliest creature on earth. Lucien drained his wine and called for more. Halfway through the dinner, a young noblewoman approached the throne. Lady Celestine, beautiful in the way noble breeding produced beautiful things. Perfect bone structure, perfect posture, perfect political pedigree. Elegant, poised, politically advantageous. She curtsied low enough to display assets while maintaining plausible deniability. Your Majesty, if I may be so bold, my father wished me to express his house's continued loyalty. Code 4, I'm being offered as a potential queen. Before the rejection, Lucien would have considered it. An advantageous match. Strong bloodlines. Political alliance. Everything a king needed to stabilize his rule and produce heirs. Now he looked at her and felt absolutely nothing. Not desire, not interest, not even mild curiosity. Just a vast, echoing emptiness where emotion should have been. Your father's loyalty is noted. He is... Celestine smiled, took a small step closer. Her perfume smelled like roses and ambition and barely concealed calculation. Perhaps your Majesty would honor our house by joining us for the hunting festival next. No. The word came out harsher than intended, sharper. Celestine flinched like he'd struck her. The nearby nobles went quiet, conversations dying mid-sentence. Lucien forced his expression into something less hostile. The Empire requires my full attention. Distractions are inadvisable. He watched Celestine retreat, her face carefully composed, but her humiliation obvious in the stiffness of her shoulders. Her father would hear about this. The other noble houses would whisper about it. Lucien didn't care, because the only scent he wanted was lavender and snow. The only eyes he wanted to see were silver. The only voice he wanted to hear was the one that had called him Your Majesty while her world shattered and she stood there taking it like a soldier taking bullets. Lucien left the feast early, found himself in the palace library, a place he rarely visited because books reminded him of his mother. Shelves stretched toward shadowed ceilings, histories of the empire, military tactics, philosophical treatises on power and governance. His father's journal sat on a shelf behind glass. Lucien stared at it for a long time before unlocking the case and pulling it out. The leather binding felt wrong in his hands, like touching a cursed artifact, like holding a loaded weapon pointed at his own head. He opened it anyway. His father's handwriting filled the pages, strong, confident strokes deteriorating into desperate scrawls as the years progressed. Lucien skimmed through campaign notes and political observations until he found the entries from after his mother's death. The bond screams inside me. Every day without her is torture. The advisors think I'm grieving. They don't understand. This is not grief. This is dying slowly. Every breath without her is another small death. Every heartbeat without hers echoing beside it is just my body refusing to accept that I'm already gone. Lucien's hands tightened on the journal. I tried to rule. Tried to focus on the Empire, but the bond is a living thing, and it's rotting inside me. My wolf is going mad. Last night I nearly killed Vylor during a strategy meeting. I don't remember why, I just remember his throat in my hand and the voice in my head screaming that everyone is the enemy, that they all took her from me. The entries grew worse, more erratic, more desperate. I see her everywhere, in empty hallways, in the gardens she used to walk. I hear her voice in the wind calling my name. The healers say it's psychological. They're wrong. The bond is killing me because half of my soul is in the ground, and I'm still walking around pretending to be whole. I am becoming the thing I always feared, a tyrant, a monster. But I cannot stop. Because stopping means admitting she's really gone. And if I admit that, I will die. So I keep moving, keep destroying, keep burning everything around me until there's nothing left but ashes and the memory of what I lost. The final entry was barely legible, written in shaking handwriting that looked like it came from a dying man. The Empire would be better off without me, but I'm too much of a coward to end it myself. So I'll keep destroying everything around me until someone else does it for me, until one of them gets brave enough to put the mad dog down. Lucien closed the journal. His hands were shaking. He'd read his father's descent into madness, watched it happen in real time as a child, but he'd always believed it was weakness, lack of discipline, emotional fragility that could have been controlled with enough willpower. Now he recognized the truth. His father hadn't been weak, he'd been bonded, and mate bonds didn't break cleanly like chains or snap like ropes. They tore out pieces of your soul and left you bleeding from wounds no one else could see, left you dying in inches while everyone around you wondered why you couldn't just move on. Lucien stood in the silent library, his father's journal in his hands, and felt something crack open in his chest. Not pain, terror, Pure, primal terror. Because he was beginning to understand that he'd made a catastrophic mistake, and there was no way to undo it. The bond was already rotting. His wolf was already going mad. And he was already walking the same path that destroyed his father. The only difference was that his father had lost his mate to death. Lucien had thrown his away on purpose, which made everything so much worse. Okay. 2 months after the rejection, Lucien sent out his first search party. He told himself it was for intelligence purposes, for security. The girl had been raised among battlefield medics. She'd spent years moving between military camps. She might share sensitive information about imperial military operations with rival territories. Troop movements, supply lines, strategic weaknesses. It was a reasonable concern, a valid justification. General Valor didn't call him a liar, but the old warrior's expression said everything his mouth didn't. The hunters returned 2 weeks later empty-handed. Seraphina Vale had vanished like smoke. No trail, no witnesses, nothing. Lucien sent out another party, then another. He deployed his best trackers, offered gold to informants in every major city, threatened border guards who might have seen her pass, put pressure on merchant guilds and traveling caravans. Nothing. The empire was vast, and one low-born healer could disappear into 1,000 villages without leaving a trace. Could change her name, dye her hair, hide those distinctive silver eyes behind colored glass, become invisible among the masses of forgotten wolves who kept the empire running while nobles played politics. Meanwhile, the bond festered. Lucien stopped attending court functions unless absolutely necessary. His chambers became a prison he rarely left except to execute whatever poor soul had drawn his attention that day. He trained until his knuckles bled and healed and bled again, drank until the nightmare softened into something manageable, raged until even his wolf went quiet from exhaustion. But nothing silenced the absence where she should have been. Nothing filled the empty space in his chest that grew larger every day. 3 months after the rejection, General Valor entered the king's chambers uninvited. A death sentence for anyone else. Lucien stood at the window in the same position he'd stood 100 times before, staring north toward the mountains. Always north. "You're going to have to kill me to get me to leave," Valor said quietly, "so you might as well listen first." Lucien didn't turn. The general continued, "The noble houses are circling. Duke Malachar has been meeting with representatives from the eastern territories. House Corvain is consolidating power in the southern provinces. They're testing the borders, testing you. The people are comparing you to your father." That got Lucien's attention. He turned slowly. Valor saw what 3 months had done to his king. Shadows under bloodshot eyes that hadn't seen real sleep in weeks. Weight loss from a frame that had always been lean muscle and hard edges. Hands that trembled slightly when they weren't clenched into fists. A man slowly destroying himself in real time. "What would you have me do?" Lucien's voice came out raw. "Find her. I've tried. Try harder. Personally. I can't leave the capital. The moment I do, Malachar and the others will move against. The moment you do, the Empire will see that you still have enough humanity left to fight for something other than power." Valor stepped closer. "You think they'll respect you more for sitting in this palace going mad? They already smell weakness. The question is whether you give them a king desperately trying to fix his mistake or a tyrant descending into the same madness that destroyed your father." Lucien stared at the old general. "She won't forgive me." "Probably not. I destroyed her in front of the entire court." "Yes, you did. I chose the Empire over her, told her she was beneath me, dismissed her like she was nothing, and now the Empire is crumbling anyway." Valor's voice softened. "You were raised to believe love makes kings weak. Your father taught you that lesson in blood and fire. But isolation is what's killing you, and a dead king serves no one." Lucien turned back to the window. Somewhere out there, beyond the northern mountains, his mate was alive. He could feel it through the rotting bond. A faint heartbeat echoing in his chest at odd hours. The ghost of her scent in empty rooms. Sometimes he heard her voice in dreams, not speaking to him but to others. Laughing, teaching, healing, alive, surviving without him. And that was the cruelest torture of all. Knowing she was fine while he fell apart. "If I go after her," Lucien said slowly, "I prove that the rejection was a lie. That I'm exactly as weak as I feared. No, Valor corrected. You prove that you're strong enough to admit when you're wrong. The only men who never make mistakes are the ones too cowardly to make real decisions. You made a choice. It was the wrong choice. Now you make a different one. Lucien closed his eyes. The bond throbbed like an infected wound that wouldn't heal. What if she's dead? Then at least you'll know. And you can stop bleeding out waiting for a heartbeat that's never coming back. What if she hates me? She should. What if I find her and she looks at me the same way she looked at me in that throne room? What if you die in this palace having never tried? Valor interrupted. What if you become exactly the monster your father was, except lonelier because you put yourself here on purpose? What if in 50 years some young king reads your journal and sees the same descent into madness and learns nothing because pride tastes better than redemption? The questions hung in the air like accusations, like prophecies. Lucien opened his eyes, made a decision that should have been made 3 months ago. Prepare a small group. No royal banners, no announcements. We leave at dawn. Valor nodded once and turned to leave. General, the old warrior paused. Thank you for not giving up on me. Valor's scarred face creased into something almost like a smile. Someone has to keep you alive until you remember how to do it yourself. 4 months after the rejection, the first rumors reached Raventhorn Palace. A silver-eyed wolf woman was organizing resistance in the outer territories, sheltering refugees from Lucien's harsher decrees, teaching villages how to defend themselves against imperial tax collectors who took more than the law allowed, building something that looked suspiciously like loyalty in places the empire had abandoned to rot. Duke Malachar brought the intelligence to the king personally, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes gleaming with barely concealed satisfaction. A rebellion, Your Majesty. Small now, insignificant, but growing. Lucien sat on his throne and felt his wolf surge forward with violent recognition. Not anger, hope. Terrible, desperate hope. What do they call her? The Moonfang Healer, sire. Apparently she's taken refuge with one of the exiled clans beyond the northern border. The ones your grandfather drove out 40 years ago for refusing to swear absolute loyalty. Lucien's hands gripped the armrests hard enough to crack stone. He knew exactly who she was. His rejected mate wasn't dead, wasn't broken, wasn't waiting for him to save her. She was building a kingdom of her own from the wolves the empire had discarded. And for the first time in 4 months, Lucien smiled. Not from joy, from the terrible understanding that everything was about to change. Because the hunt was over. He'd found her. Now came the part where he discovered whether redemption was possible for a king who'd already destroyed the only thing in the world worth saving. Lucien left Raventhorn Palace before dawn with 6 wolves. No royal banners snapping in the wind. No ceremonial armor gleaming in torchlight. No announcement to the court that their king was abandoning the capital to chase a ghost through territories that barely remembered his name. Just weapons strapped to their backs, supplies packed tight, and the kind of heavy silence that comes before violence or confession. General Valor rode beside him as they passed through the northern gates. The guards recognized their king even without the crown and regalia, even in plain leather and travel-worn boots. They saluted with fists over hearts, said nothing, knew better than to ask questions when the Alpha King's eyes looked like storm clouds about to break. The empire stretched out before them in shades of gray and dying green, and for the first time in 4 months, Lucien felt something other than the rotting emptiness in his chest. Purpose. Even if that purpose was just finding the woman he'd destroyed so he could see with his own eyes what he'd done to her. Even if it meant riding into territories that hated everything his crown represented. Even if it meant facing the truth that some mistakes don't get fixed with apologies and good intentions. The journey north stripped away every comfortable lie Lucien had been telling himself. The first village they passed through was barely surviving, homes with holes in the roofs letting rain and cold seep through. Children with hollow eyes and distended bellies, too tired to play. A well that had run dry months ago because no one had the resources or knowledge to dig deeper. The village elder approached Lucien's group with the kind of desperate hope that comes from having absolutely nothing left to lose. "Your Majesty," the old man said. His hands shook like leaves in wind. "We sent 3 petitions to the capital. Begged for help repairing the irrigation system. Never got a response. Lucien felt something crack inside his chest. Not the bond, something deeper. His certainty that he'd been ruling well. Because he remembered those petitions now. Remembered sitting in council meetings while advisors dismissed them as insignificant concerns. A minor village in a minor territory. Not worth the expense. Not strategically important enough to warrant imperial resources. He'd signed off on that decision without a second thought. Had probably been thinking about Seraphina at the time, about the bond rotting inside him, about anything except the actual lives depending on his choices. How many died? Lucien asked quietly. The elder looked confused by the question, like he couldn't quite believe the Alpha King cared about numbers. 23, Your Majesty, mostly the elderly and the very young. Thirst first, then disease when we had to use contaminated water from the river downstream. 23 people dead because Lucien had been too focused on maintaining power and crushing his own emotions to notice his empire was rotting from the inside out. 23 ghosts he'd never even known existed. Valor dismounted without asking permission, started distributing supplies from their packs. Food, clean water in sealed containers, coin enough to hire workers to repair the well properly, medicine for the sick who hadn't died yet. The elder wept. Actually wept with gratitude for receiving the bare minimum his taxes should have provided in the first place. Lucien said nothing, just climbed back on his horse and rode north with the taste of ash in his mouth and the knowledge that he'd become exactly what he'd feared. Not his father. Something worse. A king so obsessed with not being weak that he'd stopped seeing his people as human. This is what happens when you rule from a throne instead of among your people, Valor said once they were out of earshot. You stop seeing them as real. They become numbers on reports, problems to manage instead of lives to protect. I know. Do you? Because we've passed a dozen villages like that in the past week. Every single one with the same story. Petitions ignored, taxes collected with ruthless efficiency, nothing given back except the threat of violence if they complain too loudly. Lucien's hands tightened on the reins. Your father did the same thing after your mother died, Valor continued. Stopped caring about anything except maintaining control. Started seeing every request for help as a weakness to exploit. Every problem as a threat to his authority. I'm not my father. Valor looked at him with eyes that had seen too many kings make the same mistakes and tell themselves the same lies. Not yet. But you're walking his path, leaving the same trail of bodies and broken villages, and the only thing that might save you from finishing that journey is the woman you rejected, which is why we need to find her before you complete the transformation. The words hung between them like a death sentence, because Valor was right. The bond wasn't just rotting, it was metastasizing, spreading through every decision Lucien made, infecting his judgment, turning him into the kind of king who let children starve while he sat in a palace drowning in gold and self-pity. They rode harder after that, pushed the horses, minimized rest stops. Because every hour they delayed was another hour Lucien spent becoming something worse than his father ever managed. The second village showed them something that made the first look merciful. Imperial tax collectors had come through 3 days earlier. Not the official ones who followed the law and kept records. The corrupt ones who worked for Duke Malachar and took triple what was owed while keeping the excess for themselves and their duke. The village had resisted, tried to explain they'd already paid their taxes, showed receipts stamped with official seals. The collectors had burned the receipts and taken the money anyway. Then they'd taken the village elder's daughter as insurance against future resistance. She was 15 years old. The elder showed Lucien the remains of his home with shaking hands and a voice that had gone hollow from grief. Scorch marks where the collectors had started a fire to make their point clear. His wife sat in the ruins, rocking back and forth and humming something that might have been a lullaby once. Before the world taught her that songs don't protect children from men with swords and legal authority. "Where's Duke Malachar's estate?" Lucien asked. His voice came out flat. "Dead. 2 days south, Your Majesty. But he's protected by imperial law, by his title, by connections to half the noble houses in... I don't care what he's protected by." Lucien turned to Valor, met the old general's eyes and saw his own rage reflected back. "Send a rider to the capital now. I want Malachar's land seized immediately, his assets frozen, Every tax collector working under his authority arrested and executed publicly. The girl returned to her family with compensation, enough gold that they never have to worry about surviving again. Your Majesty, one of the younger wolves said carefully, if you move against a duke without a trial, without going through proper channels, the other noble houses will see it as tyranny. Will what? Lucian's voice dropped to something lethal, something that made the young wolf take a step back. Rebel? They're already positioning against me, already meeting in secret and testing the borders. At least this way I give them a reason worth the effort. He looked at the broken father standing in the ruins of his home, at the shattered mother who'd stopped speaking coherent words, at the empty space where their daughter should have been learning to heal or fight, or just exist as something other than collateral. This is what I built, he said quietly. This is what the Empire looks like when you care more about maintaining power than protecting the people that power is supposed to serve. Valor gripped his shoulder hard enough to hurt. Then we change it. After we find her. If we find her, we'll find her. And then you fix this. All of it. They rode north into territories that grew wilder with every mile. Places where imperial authority existed in name only, and even that name was mostly forgotten. Where the Empire's reach had always been thin and was now barely a memory written on old maps that no one bothered updating. These were the Forgotten Lands. The places wolves went when they wanted to disappear from history, and kings and the kind of civilization that crushed everything it touched. The Frostfang Mountains rose in the distance like broken teeth biting at gray sky, and somewhere beyond them, his mate was building something new from the pieces he'd shattered. 3 weeks into the journey, they found the first real sign that Seraphina had passed through. A village that shouldn't have existed, too organized, too healthy. Children playing in streets instead of begging for food. Adults working on communal projects instead of just trying to survive until tomorrow. A healer's station with actual medical supplies and trained staff. Gardens that suggested someone had taught them sustainable farming techniques. The village elder met them at the border with armed wolves at his back. Not hostile, just ready. Just making it clear that this village wasn't helpless anymore. State your business, the elder said. His voice carried the kind of authority that comes from leading people who chose to follow, instead of being forced. Lucien dismounted slowly, kept his hands visible and away from his weapons. We're looking for someone. A healer, silver eyes, dark hair. She would have passed through here about 4 months ago, probably half dead from a bond rejection. The elder's expression didn't change. Don't know anyone like that? He was lying. Lucien could smell it, could see it in the way the man's heartbeat sped up just slightly, the way his eyes flicked briefly to the largest building in the village center, the way the wolves behind him tensed like they were preparing to defend something precious. I'm not here to hurt her, Lucien said. I'm here because I'm the one who hurt her, and I need to make it right. One of the wolves behind the elder laughed, sharp, bitter. The sound of someone who'd heard too many empty promises from men in positions of power. You're the Alpha King. We know who you are. Word travels even this far north, even to places the Empire pretends don't exist. You think we'd tell you where she is after what you did? Lucien felt that accusation like a physical blow. What did she tell you? Didn't have to tell us anything. The wolf stepped forward. Young, maybe 25. Face scarred from fights or disease or both. Eyes hard with the kind of anger that comes from watching injustice happen over and over without being able to stop it. We saw the bond mark fading on her throat when she first arrived. Saw her collapse from the pain of a rejection that shouldn't be survivable. Took 3 days before she could stand without shaking. Another week before she could keep food down. Valor's hand tightened on Lucien's shoulder in warning. The young wolf wasn't finished. You know what she did after that? After you broke her in front of your whole God's damned court and threw her away like she was garbage? Like she was nothing? Lucien said nothing, just waited for the blow he knew was coming. She started healing people, teaching us things battlefield medics know about treating wounds and infections, organizing supply lines so we could survive the winter, helping us build irrigation systems and plan crops. Never asked for anything in return. Never even told us who she was or where she came from. Just worked until she collapsed and then got up and worked some more. The words hit harder than fists. Then how do you know who she is? Lucien managed. Because Duke Malakar's hunters came through 2 weeks after she arrived, looking for rebels and escaped tax debtors. We were about to get slaughtered. She stood between us and them and used your name, said she was under the Alpha King's protection, showed them the bond mark on her throat even though it was fading. Lucien's chest tightened until breathing hurt. What happened? They backed off. Couldn't risk killing someone who might actually be connected to you. Reported back to Malakar. And she saved 70 lives that day using the bond you tried to destroy, using the thing you rejected as a weapon to protect people you'd never even noticed existed. The village elder raised a hand. The young wolf stepped back reluctantly, still radiating fury. She's not here anymore, the elder said quietly. Moved north 2 weeks ago. Heard the Moonfang clan was reforming beyond the northern border. Went to see if she could help them too. The Moonfang clan. Lucien knew the name. Every king knew the name. They were the wolves his grandfather had exiled 40 years ago for refusing to swear absolute loyalty to the crown. Warriors who valued freedom and community over empire and dominance. They disappeared into the wilderness and become legend. Stories parents told children about wolves who lived by different rules. If Seraphina had joined them, she was beyond his reach, beyond imperial law, beyond everything except the bond that refused to die no matter how hard he'd tried to kill it. Where? Lucien asked. His voice came out rough. The elder studied him for a long moment, weighing something Lucien couldn't see. Why should we tell you anything? Why should we help you find her when all you'll probably do is hurt her again? Because I'm trying to fix the mistake I made, and every day I don't find her. Every day I stay broken, the empire gets worse. More villages like yours suffer. More people die from neglect or corruption, or just bad decisions made by a king who can't think straight because half his soul is rotting. Lucien met the elder's eyes. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to give me a chance to become worthy of her, even if I never get another chance with her specifically. The elder looked at Valor. Is he serious, or is this just another king playing games? The old general's face was grim. Unfortunately, he's serious, which might actually be worse because it means watching him try and probably fail. The elder sighed, looked tired, like he'd seen too much and survived too long to have much hope left, but couldn't quite kill it completely either. Frostfang Keep, 3 days north following the river. When it splits, take the western fork. You'll find them there. If they don't kill you first, thank you. Don't thank me. Chances are good they'll put an arrow through your throat the moment you get close. The Moonfang don't forgive easily, and she has absolutely no reason to want you alive. I know. The elder turned to leave, paused, looked back. For what it's worth, she never spoke badly of you. Never cursed your name or wished you harm. Just got quiet when people asked about the bond mark. That's more mercy than you deserved. Lucien watched the village disappear behind them as they rode north through terrain that grew rockier and colder with every mile. His wolf was howling inside him now, constant, desperate, clawing at his ribs because they were close. The bond mark on his wrist burned like it was trying to tear through his skin from the inside out. 3 more days. 3 more days and he'd see her again. The question was whether she'd let him live long enough to apologize or just put him down like the rabid animal he'd become. The landscape grew harsher as they climbed. Rocky terrain that killed horses if you weren't careful about where you stepped. Cold wind that cut through clothes like knives made of ice. Snow that never fully melted even in what passed for summer this far north. This was where the empire ended and something else began. Where forgotten wolves built their own kingdoms from the scrap civilization left behind. On the second day after leaving the village, they were attacked. 5 wolves came out of the rocks without warning. Fast. Professional. Moving like trained warriors instead of desperate bandits. Not trying to rob them. Testing their defenses. Measuring their capabilities. Lucien's group fought back hard. Steel rang against steel in the thin mountain air. Blood sprayed across snow and turned it pink. 2 of the attackers went down with killing blows. The others retreated back into the rocks like smoke dissipating. But not before one of them got close enough to see Lucien's face clearly. The wolf's eyes went wide with recognition. Alpha King. His voice carried shock and something else. Something that might have been satisfaction. Then he was gone. Vanished into the terrain like he'd never existed. They know we're coming, Valor said, wiping blood from his blade with methodical efficiency. They'll be ready. Good. You think that's good? The old general stared at him like he'd lost his mind. I think hiding would make me look like a coward. Make it seem like I'm sneaking, like I'm trying to take her by surprise or force. If I'm going to do this, I'm doing it openly. Let them know I'm coming. Let them prepare whatever defenses or tests they want. I don't want her to think I'm trying to manipulate the situation. Valor was quiet for a moment. You've changed. Not enough. Not yet. Not even close to enough. But I'm trying. They rode harder after that. Pushed through exhaustion and cold, because delay meant more time for Lucien's wolf to go completely insane from proximity to the mate they'd rejected. The western fork of the river led them into a valley surrounded by sheer cliffs on three sides. Defensible, isolated, perfect for wolves who wanted to be left alone. Frostfang Keep rose from the rocks like it had been carved from the mountain itself by ancient hands. Stone walls that had stood for centuries. Watchtowers positioned to see approaching threats from miles away. Gates thick enough to stop armies. And standing on those walls, dozens of wolves watching their approach with weapons ready and eyes that promised violence if Lucien made one wrong move. He dismounted at the base of the valley where the road ended. Stay here, he told his group. Vialor started to protest. If they wanted us dead, we'd be dead already. Arrows from those walls could kill us all before we got within 100 yards of the gates. They're waiting to see what I do, what I choose. So I'm going to walk up there alone and ask to see her. Alone? That's suicide. Probably. But it's the only move I have left that isn't coercion or force. Lucien started walking. The bond pulled at him like a rope tied around his ribs and yanked by someone running. Every step closer made it burn hotter, made his wolf thrash harder against his control, made the emptiness in his chest feel like it might actually kill him before he reached those gates. He stopped 50 feet from the walls, close enough to be heard, far enough to show he wasn't trying to force entry. I'm here to see Seraphina Vale, he called out. His voice echoed across the valley and probably carried to every ear in the keep. I'm not here to fight, not here to take her back by force, not here to use my authority or title. I just want to talk. Silence. The wind cut through the valley carrying snow. Then a figure appeared on the wall. Not Seraphina. A massive wolf, gray-haired, scarred face and arms. Alpha presence that rivaled Lucien's own. The kind of wolf who'd survived decades of violence and come out harder. You've got balls coming here, Alpha King. I'll give you that much. I'm not here as a king. I'm here as the man who destroyed his mate and spent 4 months going insane from it. The massive wolf laughed, sharp, bitter. The sound of someone who'd heard every excuse powerful men made for their cruelty. You think we care about your suffering? You rejected her in front of thousands of witnesses, humiliated her publicly, threw her away like she was worthless garbage. And now you show up expecting what exactly? Sympathy? Forgiveness? A second chance you haven't earned? No, I expect nothing. I'm just asking for a chance to see her, to apologize face to face, to try to explain why I was stupid enough to believe the throne mattered more than she did. Another figure appeared on the wall beside the massive wolf, silver eyes that caught the light, dark hair lifting in the wind. The bond detonated like a bomb going off inside Lucien's chest. He nearly dropped to his knees from the force of it. 4 months of rotting connection suddenly roaring back to life. His wolf screamed and clawed and tried to take over completely. His hands shook, his vision blurred. His heart hammered so hard he thought his ribs might crack. And Seraphina looked down at him with an expression he couldn't read. She'd changed. No longer the frightened healer who'd stood in his throne room with hope dying in her eyes while nobles laughed. Now she wore leather armor that fit like it had been made for her, had a blade at her hip that looked used, stood like someone who'd learned to fight and lead and survive without needing anyone's protection. She looked like a queen, and he looked like a beggar. Seraphina, he managed. His voice came out wrecked. She stared at him for a long moment that felt like hours. Then she spoke. Her voice carried across the valley, cold, controlled. Nothing like the warmth he remembered from the few times they'd spoken before the rejection. You came too late. 3 words. They hit harder than any weapon. Lucien felt something break inside him. Not the bond, something deeper. The last piece of pride he'd been holding on to. The last illusion that he could fix this with words and good intentions. I know, he said. I know I'm too late. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I destroyed the best thing that ever happened to me because I was terrified of becoming my father, of losing control, of caring about something more than power. Then why are you here? Because I need you to know that you were right. In that throne room, when you looked at me with hope and I crushed it in front of everyone, you were right to hope, right to believe the bond meant something, and I was wrong to reject it, wrong to think the throne was more important, wrong about everything. He took a shaking breath. His wolf was tearing him apart from the inside. The bond was screaming, but he kept talking because this might be the only chance he ever got to say this to her face. I rejected you because I thought you were weak, because I looked at you and saw vulnerability and that terrified me. But you weren't the weak one. I was. I was so terrified that loving you would break me the way loving my mother broke my father, that I broke you first, destroyed you before you could destroy me. And? Her voice stayed cold. And I've spent 4 months learning that some things don't break cleanly. They just rot, fester, spread. And they take you with them. Every day I wake up feeling like something is eating me from the inside out. Every night I dream about you dying in 100 different ways, and I can't reach you, can't save you, can't do anything except watch. Seraphina's expression didn't change. The massive wolf beside her growled low. You done feeling sorry for yourself? No, Lucien said. I'll probably never be done with that. But I am done pretending I can rule without her. Done pretending the empire matters more than the mate I rejected. Done lying to myself about what kind of king I've become. He looked directly at Seraphina. I need you to know that you deserve better than what I gave you. That you deserve a mate who sees your strength instead of fearing it. Who values you instead of discarding you like political inconvenience. I can't be that mate. I know that now. But I needed you to hear me say it before I go back to the empire and finish destroying myself trying to fix what I broke. Silence. The wind cut through the valley. Snow fell harder. Seraphina looked at the massive wolf beside her, said something too quiet for Lucien to hear, even with enhanced senses. Then she disappeared from the wall. The gates opened with a sound like stone grinding against stone, and she walked out to meet him. Alone. No guards flanking her. No weapons drawn. Just her walking across snow-covered ground toward the man who'd rejected her 4 months ago and destroyed her in front of thousands. Lucien's wolf went completely insane, demanding he close the distance, demanding he grab her and never let go, demanding he claim what was his before she disappeared again. But Lucien stayed perfectly still, because this was her choice now, her move, her power. She stopped 10 feet away, close enough to feel the bond thrumming between them like a live wire, close enough to see the damage 4 months had done to him, the weight he'd lost, the shadows carved under his eyes, the barely controlled desperation radiating off him like heat off sun-baked stone. You look like hell, she said quietly. I feel worse. Good. The word was sharp, cutting, meant to hurt, but not hateful, not completely devoid of emotion. You want to know what the last 4 months were like for me? She asked. Her voice stayed level, but something dangerous moved underneath. Because I think you've spent all this time imagining I was broken, that I was sitting somewhere waiting for you to come save me. I don't know what I imagined. I almost died, she said flatly. The rejection should have killed me. The bond tried to tear itself out of my chest. I spent 3 days in a village full of strangers, bleeding from the inside while my body tried to survive something it wasn't designed to survive. Something that goes against every natural law. Lucien felt physically sick. After that, she continued, I had 2 choices. Die or adapt. So I adapted. Learn to live with a bond that only works one direction. Learn to function while feeling like half my soul was missing. It hurt. Still hurts. But I learned to use that pain instead of letting it use me. You saved people. I helped people. There's a difference. Saving implies they were helpless without me. They weren't. They just needed someone to teach them that the Empire's version of strength isn't the only version that matters. That community and cooperation can be more powerful than domination and fear. She took a step closer. The bond flared hot enough to burn. You came here to apologize, she said, to explain why you rejected me, to make yourself feel better about what you did. But I already know why. You were scared. Scared that loving me would make you weak like your father, Scared that caring about someone more than the throne would destroy your empire. Yes. So here's what I need you to understand. You didn't reject me because I was weak. You rejected me because you were. And nothing you say here today changes that fundamental truth. I know. Do you? Because you're standing here looking like you expect me to forgive you, to fall into your arms and tell you everything's fine now, to absolve you of guilt so you can go back to being the Alpha King without the weight of what you did. Her voice hardened. But it's not fine. You publicly humiliated me, destroyed me in front of thousands of witnesses, threw me away like I was nothing, like I was trash you couldn't be bothered to dispose of properly. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, just enough to show the wound was still there, still bleeding underneath the armor she'd built. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Lucien said. His voice came out raw. I'm just asking you to let me try to become worthy of you, to fix the empire, to become the kind of king who deserves a mate like you, even if I never get another chance with you specifically. Why should I care what kind of king you become? Because the empire is full of people like the ones I met on this journey. Starving villages ignored by corrupt governors. Children dying because their petitions get dismissed as insignificant. Families destroyed by tax collectors who work for nobles like Duke Malachar. And I built that system. I maintained it. I let it happen because I was too focused on maintaining power and crushing my own emotions to notice I was destroying everything worth protecting. Seraphina stared at him with those silver eyes that saw through every defense. So fix it. I'm trying. Try harder. She turned to walk away. Lucien's wolf screamed at him to stop her, to grab her wrist, to fall to his knees and beg until she had no choice but to acknowledge him. But he'd already done enough damage by forcing his will on her once. So he just said the truest thing he'd ever said out loud. I love you. 3 words he'd never said to anyone. 3 words he'd been too terrified to even think. Seraphina froze mid-step, turned slowly. Her expression was unreadable. What did you say? I love you. I don't know when it started. Maybe the moment the bond formed. Maybe before. Maybe the first time I saw you in that battlefield hospital, covered in blood and exhaustion, but still saving lives like it was the only thing that mattered. I don't know, but I love you. And rejecting you didn't change that. It just taught me that some bonds don't break when you try to kill them. They just bleed forever. Her silver eyes searched his face, looking for the lie, looking for manipulation, finding only raw, desperate, completely honest truth. You're 4 months too late, she said quietly. I know. And I don't forgive you. I know. And I'm not coming back to Raventhorn with you. I'm not asking you to. Then what are you asking for? Nothing. I'm not asking for anything. I'm just telling you the truth because you deserve to hear it. You deserve better than what I gave you. Better than a king too broken and terrified to see what he had until he destroyed it. He took a breath that hurt. The bond burned between them like a bridge on fire. But if you ever need anything, if the Empire threatens you or these people you're protecting, if anyone comes after you with violence or legal authority, you use my name, you use the bond, you use whatever leverage you need, because even if you never forgive me, I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you're safe and protected. Seraphina stared at him for a long moment. Then she did something he didn't expect. She stepped forward and placed her hand directly over his heart. The bond exploded. Lucien gasped, his knees buckled. The connection roared to life like a wildfire that had been smoldering for 4 months just waiting for oxygen. But she didn't pull him close, didn't kiss him, didn't offer comfort or absolution. She just looked him directly in the eyes and said 4 words that destroyed him more completely than the rejection ever had. Earn me back, Lucien. Then she walked away, left him standing in the snow with a bond that was finally fully alive again and absolutely no idea how to do what she'd asked. Behind him, Vialor and the others waited in silence. Ahead of him, the gates of Frostfang Keep closed with finality. And somewhere in between, Lucien realized he'd just reached the point of no return. Because going back to being the king he was before wasn't an option anymore. That king was dead. He had to become someone completely new. Someone worthy of the woman who'd just given him a chance he absolutely didn't deserve. Or die trying. Lucien rode back to Raventhorn Palace a different man than the one who'd left. Not better, not redeemed, Just different in the way broken things are different after you try to put them back together and realize some pieces don't fit the way they used to. Some pieces have changed shape, some are missing entirely. Earn me back. 2 words that had become his entire existence. His purpose. The only thing keeping him from descending completely into the madness that had claimed his father and turned him into a cautionary tale whispered in council chambers. The journey south took 2 weeks through terrain that seemed determined to remind him of everything he'd ignored while sitting on his throne. Every mile closer to the capital, Lucien felt the weight of the crown settling back onto his shoulders like chains. But this time the weight felt different. Not like armor protecting him from the world. Like a noose he'd tied himself and was now being forced to wear. Veilor rode beside him in silence most of the way. The old general knew better than to offer comfort or advice when a man was trying to figure out how to rebuild himself from scratch. Knew that some lessons only stuck when you learned them in blood and failure. On the 7th day they passed through the village where the elder's daughter had been taken by Malakar's collectors. The girl was back home. Lucien had made sure of that before leaving for the north, had sent riders with orders that made his intentions clear. But the father's eyes still carried the hollow look of someone who'd learned that safety was an illusion and authority could be wielded like a weapon against the innocent. "Your Majesty," the elder said when Lucien stopped. His voice carried gratitude and wariness in equal measure, like a man who'd been burned and was still standing too close to fire. "My daughter is home." "Thank you." "Don't thank me." Lucien's voice came out rough, raw. "Thank me when the Empire stops producing men like Malakar. Thank me when you don't have to fear tax collectors more than you fear enemy armies at your borders." The elder nodded slowly, said nothing more. What was there to say to a king who was finally seeing what his empire actually looked like from the ground level? They rode on, but Lucien carried that hollow look with him, added it to the growing collection of ghosts he was accumulating, evidence of what his reign had actually accomplished versus what he'd told himself it accomplished while sitting in his obsidian palace drinking expensive wine. When Raventhorn Palace finally came into view, rising from volcanic rock like a monument to dominance and control, Lucy felt nothing but exhaustion. The throne room awaited. So did the vipers who called themselves nobility. The first council meeting after his return should have been a warning, should have sent every instinct he possessed into overdrive. Duke Malakar wasn't present. Neither were 3 other major noble houses who usually attended every session like clockwork. Their seats sat empty like missing teeth in a skull, like gaps in a smile that used to be whole. General Veilor noticed immediately. His hand drifted toward his sword in that unconscious way warriors developed after decades of surviving political intrigue disguised as governance. Lucien noticed too, but said nothing. Just took his place on the throne and waited for the remaining council members to explain themselves, to justify the absences, to lie to his face with the confidence of people who thought he was too broken to see through them. Lord Corvain spoke first, an older wolf with silver hair and eyes like chips of ice, a survivor of 3 different regimes, the kind of political predator who thrived by knowing exactly when to support a king and when to arrange for his replacement. "Your Majesty, welcome back from your journey. We trust it was productive." The pause before journey carried weight, judgment, mockery barely concealed beneath formal courtesy. Everyone in this room knew where he'd gone and why. Knew he'd chased his rejected mate like a lovesick fool while the empire fell apart. "It was productive," Lucien said flatly. "Where is Duke Malakar?" "Duke Malakar has taken ill, Your Majesty. He sends his regrets and his assurances of continued loyalty to the crown." Bullshit. The word echoed through the throne room like a stone dropped in still water. Several council members flinched. Lord Corvain's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Surprise, maybe. Or satisfaction that the king was confirming exactly how unstable he'd become. "Your Majesty, Malakar isn't ill. He's positioning. Probably meeting with representatives from the eastern territories or the southern houses. Probably discussing how best to move against a king who's shown weakness by chasing after his rejected mate like he's lost his mind." Silence fell heavy and dangerous. The kind of silence that comes before violence or confession, or both. Then Lord Corvain smiled, thin, reptilian, the smile of a predator who'd just realized its prey was wounded and alone. Your Majesty is perceptive as always. What I am is tired, Lucien said. His voice dropped to something lethal. Tired of games. Tired of noble houses treating the empire like a chessboard where the pieces are people's lives. So let's skip the political dance and the careful wording. Tell me what's actually happening. Corvain glanced at the other nobles present. Some kind of silent communication passed between them. The kind that happens when conspirators realize they've been caught but aren't sure whether to commit or retreat. Very well, Corvain said slowly. Since your Majesty prefers directness, Duke Malachar and several other houses have expressed concerns about your recent behavior. The rejection of your mate before the entire court, the subsequent instability, the harsh punishments, the erratic decisions, the journey north that left the capital without proper royal leadership for weeks. I left General Valor in command with full authority. With respect, Your Majesty, General Valor is not the king. He cannot make certain decisions that require royal blood and legitimate authority. And in your absence, certain situations arose that required immediate resolution. What situations? Border conflicts with the eastern territories that escalated beyond normal diplomatic channels. Trade disputes with the southern provinces that threatened to collapse entire supply networks. Internal matters regarding taxation and noble privileges. Questions of succession and contingency planning should your condition worsen beyond succession. Lucien's voice dropped to something that made even Corvain take a half step back. You're discussing succession while I'm still breathing, while I'm still sitting on this throne. Lord Corvain's smile widened slightly, showing teeth. Only as a contingency, Your Majesty. Only as responsible planning in case your condition worsens beyond recovery. My condition. The rejected bond. The madness it causes in alpha wolves. Your father's descent is well documented in imperial records. The council merely wishes to ensure the empire's stability should history repeat itself. Should you follow the same path he walked. Lucien stood slowly. The movement made every wolf in the room tense like prey animals suddenly realizing the predator was closer than they thought. Let me make something very clear to all of you. I am not my father. What's happening to me is not madness. It's consequence. It's what happens when you destroy something precious because you're too terrified to protect it. And unlike my father, I'm actually trying to fix what I broke instead of burning the empire down around me while I scream at ghosts. He stepped down from the dais, walked toward Lord Corvain with deliberate slowness, each footfall echoing in the silent chamber. So you can tell Malachar and whoever else is plotting with him that if they want my crown, they're going to have to take it from my corpse. And I promise you the cost will be considerably higher than they're willing to pay. Lord Corvain didn't flinch, didn't back down, just met Lucien's eyes with the confidence of someone who'd already won and was just waiting for the king to realize it. That's exactly the kind of response that concerns us, Your Majesty. The aggression, the paranoia, the inability to accept counsel or see reason. These are all symptoms your father displayed before. It's not paranoia when they're actually plotting against you, when they're actually sharpening knives and counting votes and measuring the throne for their own ass. Lucien turned to address the entire council. Every remaining noble who'd bothered to show up. This meeting is over. Get out, all of you. And tell your co-conspirators that I'll be auditing every noble house's finances starting tomorrow morning. Every tax record, every land holding, every backroom deal and corrupt arrangement. If I find corruption, I'll burn it out root and stem regardless of whose name is attached. The council filed out in tense silence. Some quickly, some with barely concealed contempt, all of them already calculating their next moves. Only Valor remained after the doors closed. The old general waited until the last footsteps faded before speaking. That was a mistake. Probably. But I'm done pretending everything is fine while they sharpen knives behind my back and smile to my face. You just confirmed every fear they have, gave them ammunition, made yourself look exactly as unstable and dangerous as they're claiming to anyone who will listen. Maybe I am unstable. Maybe the bond rejection did break something fundamental in me that won't heal properly. But at least now I'm trying to use that brokenness for something other than casual cruelty and maintaining power. Valor crossed his arms, old scars visible on his forearms like a map of every battle he'd survived. Noble sentiment, Won't stop them from killing you and installing whoever they've already chosen as puppet king. Then they kill me. But I'm not backing down. Not compromising. Not anymore. What happened to earning her back? You can't do that if you're dead and buried in the imperial crypts. The words hit like a physical blow to the chest, because Vialor was absolutely right. Seraphina had given him a purpose, a goal, something to work toward that wasn't just maintaining power for power's sake, a reason to become better instead of just becoming harder. And he was about to throw it away by forcing a confrontation with nobles who'd been playing these games since before he was born, who'd survived his father's madness and knew exactly how to manipulate a broken king. "What do I do?" Lucien asked quietly. Honest question from a man who'd run out of answers. You do what you should have done months ago. You start actually ruling instead of just reacting. You build alliances with the houses that aren't actively plotting your death. You fix the corruption from the inside out instead of trying to burn everything down and hoping something better grows from the ashes. And if they move against me while I'm doing that, if they see me trying to build instead of destroy and decide that's the perfect moment to strike, then we fight. But at least we fight from a position of strength instead of isolated paranoia. At least we fight with allies instead of alone. Lucien stared at the empty throne. The crown sat on the black stone seat, volcanic glass and silver, beautiful and heavy and poisonous. Everything he'd sacrificed Seraphina to keep. Earn me back. He could hear her voice, feel her hand on his chest, see those silver eyes looking at him like he was worth saving if he was willing to do the actual work instead of just talking about change. "Fine," he said. "We do it your way. Build alliances, fix corruption from within, become the king she thinks I could be if I stop being terrified long enough to try." Valor nodded once. "Good. Now get some sleep. You look like death warmed over." "I feel worse." That became Lucien's new reality for the next 3 weeks. Days spent auditing noble house finances and finding exactly the corruption he expected. Malachar had been embezzling imperial funds for years, skimming off the top of tax collections, selling positions and privileges. Other houses had similar schemes running like clockwork. Land grabs disguised as legal transfers, tax fraud hidden in bureaucratic paperwork, bribery of imperial officials at every level. The rot went deeper than Lucien had imagined in his worst nightmares. He started making arrests, seizing assets, redistributing wealth back to the villages that had been systematically robbed for decades. Trying to build the empire Seraphina deserved, even if she never forgave him enough to see it. It should have felt good. Should have felt like justice finally being served. Instead, it felt like pulling weeds from a garden that was 90% weeds and 10% struggling flowers. Every corruption he exposed revealed 3 more underneath. Every problem he solved created 2 new ones. The system was designed to resist change, built to protect those at the top while grinding those at the bottom into dust. Meanwhile, the bond ached constantly, a steady throb of absence that reminded him every moment of every day that Seraphina was out there, somewhere beyond his reach, healing people, building communities, being the kind of leader he was failing to become despite his best efforts. He wrote her letters he never sent. Long, rambling things about what he was trying to do and why it was harder than he'd expected. About the villages he'd visited and the people he'd failed. About how much he missed her even though he had no right to miss something he'd thrown away. He burned the letters in his fireplace late at night while his wolf howled inside him like a caged animal slowly going insane. On the 18th day after returning to the capital, General Valor burst into Lucien's chambers without knocking. Something he only did when death was imminent. "We have a problem." Lucien looked up from the tax records he'd been reviewing until his eyes burned. Valor's face carried the expression he wore before battles they weren't sure they'd survive. "What kind of problem?" "Malachar and 6 other noble houses just declared formal opposition to your rule. They're claiming you're unfit to lead due to bond madness and erratic behavior. They've got signed testimonies from healers, depositions from council members, legal precedent from your father's reign, everything wrapped up in proper bureaucracy to make it look legitimate." Lucien stood slowly. His chair scraped against stone. "They're moving. They've already moved. They've got armies gathering at 3 different points around the capital. Intelligence reports say maybe 15,000 wolves total. Professional soldiers, well-equipped, not a mob, an actual military force. We have what? 20,000 in the capital garrison? Less. You sent half our forces to the border territories to stop the corruption and protect the villages. Remember? Part of fixing the empire instead of just maintaining control? The trap closed around Lucien with perfect clarity. They waited until I committed forces elsewhere, until I was isolated and weakened, until I'd made enough enemies by arresting corrupt nobles that other houses would support their claim just to protect themselves. Valor nodded grimly. They played you, used your guilt and your desire to change against you like a weapon. Now they're going to kill you and install whoever they've already chosen as puppet king, probably someone who'll reverse every reform you started and go back to business as usual. Lucien felt cold spread through his chest. Not fear exactly, more like calculation mixed with acceptance. How long before they reach the capital? 3 days? Maybe 4 if weather slows them down or we get lucky. And our allies? Houses that might support us? What allies? You've spent the past 3 weeks arresting nobles and seizing their assets and threatening everyone with audits. The houses that aren't actively opposing you are too terrified or too calculating to support you. They're waiting to see who wins before choosing sides. So I'm alone. Not alone. You have me. You have the wolves loyal to you personally instead of just loyal to the crown and whoever wears it. Maybe 5,000 total if we're generous with the count. Against 15,000 professional soldiers led by experienced commanders. The math was bad, catastrophically bad. Valor's expression was grim. We could run, take the loyal forces and retreat north, regroup with the Moonfang clan maybe, live to fight another day from a position of no. Lucien's voice came out flat and final. I'm not running. I spent 4 months running from the bond, from responsibility, from everything that actually mattered. I'm done running from hard choices, then you're choosing death. You understand that? This isn't bravery, this is suicide. Maybe, or maybe I'm finally choosing to become the king I should have been from the start. The one who stands and fights for what's right, even when the odds are impossible. He crossed to the window, stared out at the capital spreading below the palace like a living organism. Thousands of wolves living their lives. Families, children, merchants and craftsmen and healers and soldiers. People who'd done nothing wrong except live under a system that ground them down and called it civilization. If I run, Malachar takes the throne. Everything I've started to fix goes back to how it was. Worse probably, because he'll make examples of anyone who supported me. All those villages I promised to protect get crushed. All those people who started to believe the empire could actually change lose that hope. So what's the alternative? Die heroically and accomplish nothing except a good death? We fight, and we make sure that even if I die proving that change is possible, that a king can care about more than just maintaining power. Maybe that example matters. Maybe it plants seeds. Valor was quiet for a long moment. She'd be proud of you, for whatever that's worth. It's worth everything. The next 2 days were organized chaos. Lucien fortified the capital as best he could with limited forces and time, called in every favor he'd accumulated, offered amnesty to criminals willing to fight for something other than themselves, freed prisoners who'd been locked up for minor offenses or political convenience. He also sent a message north, to Frostfang Keep, to Seraphina. He didn't ask for help, didn't beg her to save him or send reinforcements, just told her what was happening and why. Told her that he was going to fight for the empire she deserved, even if he didn't survive to see it built. Told her about the villages he'd visited and the people he was trying to protect. Told her he loved her one more time. He didn't expect a response, didn't expect anything except maybe a quiet acknowledgement that he'd tried. On the 3rd day, scouts reported Malachar's forces approaching from the south in perfect military formation, larger than expected, better armed. This wasn't just a coup. It was an execution dressed up as legitimate regime change. Lucien stood on the walls of Raventhorn Palace and watched the army approach like an incoming storm. 15,000 wolves carrying banners of noble houses who'd smiled to his face while sharpening knives for his back. Valor stood beside him in silence. Last chance to run, the old general said quietly. Not running. Didn't think so. They stood together as the army stopped just outside arrow range. Professional discipline, no rushing forward, no amateur mistakes. These were soldiers who knew exactly what they were doing. A single rider approached under a white flag of parley. Duke Malachar himself, smug, certain of victory, radiating the confidence of someone who'd already won and was just here to collect. He stopped within shouting distance. Alpha King Lucien, I come with terms for your consideration. I'm listening. Abdicate, publicly. Name me as your successor and regent. In exchange, I'll let you live. You can retreat to some remote territory and live out your days in comfortable exile. And if I refuse, then we take the capital by force. Kill you. Kill everyone loyal to you. Burn out every reform you started. And install a new king anyway. Your choice is whether this ends with minimal bloodshed or turns this entire city into a graveyard. Lucien looked at the army behind Malachar, looked at his own forces on the walls. Did the math again. It still came out the same way. Valor was right. This was suicide, but some things were worth dying for. He looked directly at Malachar, spoke loud enough for both armies to hear clearly. Here are my terms. Take your army and leave. Disband. Go home. In exchange, I'll show mercy instead of justice. Exile instead of execution for treason. Malachar laughed. Genuine amusement. You're outnumbered 3-1. You have no leverage, no allies, no hope of survival, and you're offering me terms? I have the crown. I have legitimacy. I have the loyalty of wolves who chose to stand with me instead of being forced. And I have something you'll never have no matter how many armies you command. What's that? The willingness to die for what I believe instead of killing for what I want. Noble words, Malachar said. They'll look great carved on your tombstone. He turned his horse. We attack at dawn. Prepare your wolves for death, false king. He rode back to his army. Valor let out a long breath. Well, that went about as well as expected. Lucien watched the sun setting behind enemy banners. One more night to become the king Seraphina believed he could be, even if he didn't live to see morning. That night, Lucien didn't sleep. Couldn't sleep. He walked the walls talking to his wolves, told them they could leave if they wanted, that he wouldn't hold it against them, that loyalty to a doomed king wasn't worth dying for if they had families or futures worth protecting. Not one of them left. Some had been soldiers under his father, some were young wolves who'd joined recently, some were criminals he'd pardoned, but all of them chose to stay and fight for something that probably wouldn't survive the morning. And Lucien realized something profound in those dark hours before dawn. This was what real power looked like. Not fear, not dominance, not forcing submission through violence and superior strength. This was wolves choosing to stand beside him even when it meant certain death, choosing to believe in what he was trying to build instead of fleeing to safety and survival. This was what he'd rejected when he rejected Seraphina, the power of being worthy instead of just being strong. Dawn came too fast and too cold. Malachar's army advanced in perfect formation, professional, overwhelming, certain of victory. This wasn't their first battle, wasn't their first coup. They knew exactly how to break a smaller force. Lucien stood on the walls with his 5,000 wolves and prepared to die. The bond in his chest ached with a pain that had nothing to do with physical wounds, just the knowledge that he'd finally figured out how to be worthy right before it stopped mattering. I'm sorry, he thought toward wherever Seraphina was. I tried. I wasn't good enough fast enough. But I tried. The enemy army was 200 yards away when the northern horizon exploded with movement. Not an explosion, but that's what it looked like as thousands of wolves poured over the hills like a flood breaking through a dam. Banners Lucien didn't recognize. Wolves that moved like warriors who'd never stopped training even in exile. The Moonfang clan. The exiled wolves his grandfather had driven out 40 years ago for refusing absolute submission. And leading them, silver eyes flashing in dawn light like polished mirrors, was Seraphina. The mate he'd rejected had come to save him. Malachar's army saw the reinforcements and faltered. 15,000 wolves suddenly facing equal or greater numbers. The advantage gone. The easy execution turned into actual battle with uncertain outcome. Malachar screamed orders. His army tried to regroup, tried to adapt to changed circumstances. But they'd come expecting an execution, not a war. And the Moonfang wolves hit them like a hammer. The battle that followed was brutal and short and painted the ground red. Malakar's forces broke within 2 hours, scattered, surrendered. Some tried to flee and were cut down. Others threw down weapons and begged mercy they probably didn't deserve. Lucien fought like a man possessed, not trying to survive, trying to prove he deserved the rescue he hadn't asked for and didn't expect. When the fighting finally ended, he stood in the middle of carnage and survivors trying to process what had just happened. Seraphina had saved him. The woman he'd destroyed had come back and saved him anyway. She walked through the battlefield toward him, blood on her armor, exhaustion in her eyes, but alive, whole, strong in ways he was still learning to recognize. Lucien dropped to his knees before she reached him, not as a king surrendering his crown, as a man who'd finally understood what he'd lost and what it had cost her to come back anyway. "Why?" he asked. His voice barely worked. "Why did you come? Why save me after what I did?" Seraphina looked down at him, her expression unreadable. "Because you were right about one thing. The Empire is full of people who deserve better than what they're getting, and as much as I want to hate you for what you did, I can't let those people suffer just because you were too stupid and terrified to see what you had." She paused. "Also because your letter said you were going to die trying to fix things, and I decided I wasn't ready for you to die yet. Not before you actually earned me back like I told you to." She offered her hand. "Get up, Lucien, you've got work to do. We both do." He took her hand, let her pull him to his feet. But as he stood, he saw something in her eyes that made his blood freeze and his wolf go instantly alert. Not love, not forgiveness, not even acceptance. Calculation. And he realized with dawning horror that something was very wrong with this picture. Seraphina had saved him, but rescue and forgiveness were not the same thing, and the wolves surrounding them now weren't all Moonfang warriors. Some wore Malakar's colors still. Some wore banners from houses that should have been his enemies. All of them looked to Seraphina like she was the one giving orders. Lucien looked at Veilor, saw the same realization hitting the old general's face, saw his hand move toward his sword before stopping because they were surrounded and outnumbered by wolves who'd supposedly just saved them. The trap hadn't closed during the battle. It was closing right now. Seraphina's expression shifted, hardened, became something he'd never seen on her face before. Something cold and calculating and absolutely certain. "You wanted to earn me back," she said quietly. Her voice carried across the sudden silence. "So here's your chance. Your one chance. Give me the crown." "What?" "You heard me clearly. Abdicate. Right here. Right now. In front of both armies. Make me queen and step down." Lucien stared at her. His mate. His salvation. The woman he'd destroyed and who'd come back to save him. Except she hadn't come to save him. She'd come to take everything he had left. This was the betrayal he should have seen coming. The consequence finally arriving to collect its debt in full. The mate he'd rejected showing him exactly what rejection actually felt like when you were powerless to stop it. And Lucien had to choose between the crown he'd killed himself trying to keep and the woman who'd just proven she was stronger, smarter, and more ruthless than he'd ever given her credit for being. Lucien stared at Seraphina standing before him, surrounded by thousands of wolves, who answered to her command now, not his mate, his salvation. The woman he'd destroyed who'd just proven she was capable of playing the same brutal game he'd been playing his entire life. Except she was better at it, sharper, more ruthless, willing to use the bond itself as a weapon in ways he'd never considered. "You want the crown," he said. His voice came out flat, empty of everything except cold understanding and the taste of blood in his mouth. "I want what you took from me." Seraphina's silver eyes held no mercy, no softness, no trace of the healer who'd stood trembling in his throne room 4 months ago. Just the hard calculation of someone who'd learned to survive by becoming exactly what she needed to be. "You rejected me in front of thousands of witnesses. Humiliated me publicly. Threw me away like I was worthless garbage. Now I'm taking everything you value, and you get to feel exactly what that's like." The bond between them thrummed with twisted energy, not the gentle pull of mates meant to complement each other. Something sharper, angrier, a connection that had been broken and badly fused back together, like bones that healed wrong and now caused constant pain. Around them, both armies watched in absolute silence. Lucien's loyal wolves on the walls looking confused and betrayed, wondering if their king had led them into a trap. Malakar's surrendered forces looking satisfied that the false king was finally getting the consequences he deserved. The Moonfang clan standing ready with weapons that could cut down anyone who moved wrong. Valor's hand stayed on his sword. The old general's face was carved from stone in fury, waiting for orders that would probably get them all killed, but unwilling to surrender without bleeding the betrayers first. "This is what you learned out there?" Lucien asked quietly, his voice carried across the battlefield despite its softness. "How to manipulate and betray. How to use people's trust as a weapon against them. How to become exactly what I was. I learned how to survive in a world where kings throw away their mates for political convenience, where power matters more than people or bonds or anything real." Seraphina's voice stayed level, cold. "You taught me that lesson very thoroughly in front of your entire court. So this is revenge dressed up as justice. This is consequence. This is what happens when you destroy someone and assume they'll stay broken." Seraphina stepped closer. The bond flared hot enough to burn through his chest. "You wanted to earn me back. Wanted to prove you'd changed. Here's your chance. Give me the crown. Step down. Let me fix the empire you broke while obsessing over maintaining control and proving you weren't weak like your father. And if I refuse, if I tell you to go to hell and take your army with you, then my wolves and Malakar's remaining forces cut down your 5,000 loyal soldiers and take the crown anyway. More blood, more death, more waste, more wolves dying for their leaders' mistakes. But the outcome is exactly the same either way. You lose, I win. Choose how many die in the process." Lucien looked at the faces surrounding him. Wolves who'd stood with him expecting to die for something meaningful, now being used as hostages to force his surrender. Young soldiers who'd believed his promises about changing the empire. Veterans like Valor who'd served loyally through everything, all of them waiting to see if their king would sacrifice them or his crown. He looked at Valor. The old general's expression said everything without words. Said this was the end game they should have seen coming. Said that trust was always the weapon that killed you in the end. Said to give the order and they'd fight anyway because some things were worth dying for even when the cause was already lost. "There's a third option," Lucien said slowly. His voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. Seraphina raised an eyebrow, waiting, not dismissing him but clearly skeptical that he had any leverage left. "We fight. Right here. Right now. You and me. Alpha to alpha. Single combat in front of both armies. Winner takes the crown and the complete loyalty of both forces. No more innocent wolves dying for our mistakes." The silence that followed was absolute and crushing. Every wolf present held their breath. This wasn't how these situations ended. Kings didn't offer single combat when they were cornered. They ordered suicide charges or negotiated surrender or fled into exile. They didn't challenge their rejected mates to settle things with claws and teeth. Then Seraphina smiled. Not warmly, not with affection or forgiveness. Like a wolf baring teeth before tearing out a throat. "You want to fight me for the crown. After everything. After rejecting me and destroying me and spending months drowning in self-pity while the empire fell apart. You actually think you can beat me in single combat, and that somehow makes this situation right. I think I owe you the chance to tear me apart personally instead of watching your soldiers do it from a distance. I think if you want revenge, you should take it yourself with your own claws. And I think the wolves deserve to see their leaders settle this like warriors instead of politicians playing games with other people's lives." Seraphina studied him for a long moment, looking for the trap, the angle, the manipulation hiding beneath the offer, looking for the way this served his interests instead of hers, finding only exhaustion and something that might have been honest acceptance of consequences. "Fine," she said. Her voice carried across the battlefield. "We fight. No weapons, no armor, just claws and teeth and the bond you tried to murder. When I win, I take the crown and you spend the rest of your pathetic life watching me build the empire you couldn't. And if I win, you won't. But if I do, I give you the crown anyway, because you'll have proven you're stronger than I ever was, that you deserve to rule more than I do." The watching armies erupted in motion, wolves backing away to create a circle. This wasn't a formal duel with rules and ceremony and referees. This was two alphas settling something that went deeper than politics or power or who sat on what throne. This was about the bond itself, about what happens when you break something sacred and then try to pretend you can fix it with good intentions and pretty words. Lucien stripped off what remained of his armor, let the blood-soaked metal fall to ground already painted red. Seraphina did the same with efficient movements. No hesitation, no second thoughts. They circled each other in the center of the makeshift arena with thousands of eyes watching every movement, every breath, every flicker of emotion that crossed their faces. The bond between them pulled and pushed simultaneously, trying to bring them together while tearing them apart. A physical thing that made breathing difficult and thinking harder and existing in the same space almost unbearable. "You know what the worst part was?" Seraphina said as they circled. Her voice carried across the silent battlefield, each word clear and cutting. Not the rejection itself, not the public humiliation in front of your entire court. The worst part was that I still felt the bond trying to complete itself while you were crushing it. Still felt my body trying to reach for you while my mind was screaming that you were actively destroying me. I know. You don't know. You can't possibly know what it's like to have every instinct telling you to trust someone, to love them, to complete the bond, while they publicly prove you're worthless to them. While nobles laugh and your mate looks at you like you're garbage, he can't be bothered to dispose of properly. You're right. I can't know that specific pain, but I know what it's like to spend 4 months slowly going insane from a bond that won't die no matter how hard you try to kill it, to feel you out there somewhere surviving and thriving without me while I fell apart one piece at a time. Good. Seraphina's eyes flashed gold, her wolf rising close to the surface. I hope it hurt every single day. I hope every breath was agony. I hope you suffered exactly as much as I did. She attacked without warning, fast, vicious, no hesitation or mercy, claws extended and aimed directly for his throat, going for the kill immediately instead of testing defenses or feeling him out. Lucien barely dodged, felt her claws tear through his shoulder instead of his neck. Pain exploded white-hot, but he ignored it. Had spent decades learning to fight through worse, countered with a strike aimed at her ribs that she deflected easily, too easily, like she'd been training specifically for this moment. They traded blows in brutal silence. No taunting, no wasted breath, no dramatic speeches. Just two alphas trying to hurt each other in ways that went far beyond physical damage. Because this fight wasn't really about the crown or the empire or who deserved to rule. It was about every moment of pain and betrayal and broken trust, every night spent dreaming of someone who destroyed you. Every time the bond screamed that you were meant to be together, while reality proved you were meant to suffer. Seraphina was faster than Lucien expected, stronger. She'd been training with the Moonfang warriors for 4 months while he'd been sitting in his palace drowning in guilt and wine. She knew exactly where to hit to make him drop his guard, knew which strikes would trigger the bond and make him hesitate. But Lucien had been fighting wars since he was barely old enough to shift. He knew how to take damage, how to use pain as fuel instead of letting it slow him down, how to wait for the opening that always came when someone fought with emotion instead of pure calculation. The opening came when Seraphina overextended on a strike aimed at his chest, putting too much force behind it, committing too fully. Lucien caught her wrist mid-strike, twisted hard, used her own momentum against her and slammed her into the ground with bone-cracking force. The watching armies gasped collectively, thousands of wolves reacting as one. Seraphina rolled immediately, combat training overriding pain, came up bleeding from a split lip and scrapes across her face, spat blood onto already red ground and smiled like she was actually enjoying this. "Better," she said. Her voice carried satisfaction instead of fear. "For a minute there, I thought the Broken King had forgotten how to fight. Thought you'd become too soft and guilty to actually hurt someone. Never too soft to survive." She charged again without warning. This time Lucien met her head-on instead of evading. They collided with force that would have shattered normal bones. Claws tearing through flesh and muscle, teeth snapping close to throats and vulnerable places. The bond between them screaming and flaring with every impact like it was being electrocuted. And somewhere in the violence, through the pain and blood and desperation, Lucien realized something crucial. She wasn't fighting to win. She was fighting to make him feel what she'd felt. Every strike was calculated to hurt, but not cripple completely. Every opening she left was an invitation for him to hurt her back, to prove he was still capable of violence, still willing to damage her if that's what survival required. This wasn't a battle for the crown. This was a conversation in blood and pain and broken bones, because words had failed them so completely that violence was the only language left. So Lucien stopped trying to win efficiently, started fighting the way she was fighting, making her feel every ounce of pain he'd carried for 4 months, showing her through violence what the rejection had cost him, what waking up every morning feeling like half his soul was missing had done to his sanity, proving that her suffering wasn't unique or special, that they'd both been destroyed by what happened in that throne room. The fight became something else entirely, something brutal and honest that neither of them knew how to express any other way. A dance of violence that said everything they couldn't put into words. They broke apart finally after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, both bleeding from dozens of wounds, both exhausted, the bond between them raw and exposed like a wound that someone kept pouring salt into. Seraphina stood across from him, breathing hard, blood running down her arms and soaking into her clothes, eyes bright with something that might have been tears, or might have been rage, or might have been both simultaneously. "You were supposed to beg," she said. Her voice cracked for the first time. "You were supposed to fall to your knees and plead, and give me the satisfaction of watching you grovel, like I had to stand there and take your rejection without fighting back. I'll grovel if that's what you need." Lucien's voice came out rough, raw, wrecked. "I'll spend the rest of my life on my knees apologizing if it helps you heal, but it won't fix what I broke, won't heal what I destroyed, won't undo the damage I did to both of us. Then what will? What possibly fixes this? I don't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe we're both too damaged now. Maybe the bond is so twisted and broken that we'll spend forever hurting each other because that's all we remember how to do anymore." He took a step toward her. The bond pulled hard enough to crack ribs. "But I know I'd rather spend my life trying to earn you back and probably failing than sitting on that throne, pretending I didn't destroy the only thing that ever actually mattered." Seraphina looked at him with silver eyes that held 4 months of pain and survival and transformation. Eyes that had seen the worst of what life could do and had somehow come out the other side harder instead of broken. "You think words fix this? You think admitting you were wrong somehow makes the humiliation go away? Makes standing in that throne room being destroyed in front of thousands just disappear? No. Words fix absolutely nothing. But actions might. So here's what I'm offering." Lucien dropped to one knee in front of her, in front of both assembled armies. Every wolf watching their alpha king kneel before the mate he'd rejected months ago. "Take the crown. Rule the empire. I'll serve you however you want. Advisor, general, prisoner in your dungeons. Whatever helps you sleep at night knowing you got justice. You were right that day at Frostfang Keep. You've proven you're stronger than me, smarter, more capable of leading. So lead, and I'll follow." The silence that followed was crushing in its completeness. Thousands of wolves holding their breath, waiting to see what the rejected mate would do when handed absolute power over the man who'd destroyed her. Seraphina stared down at him, at the Alpha King on his knees covered in blood and battle damage and absolute sincerity, at the man who'd destroyed her offering to destroy himself if that's what she required for peace. "Get up," she said quietly. "Seraphina, get up, Lucien, right now." He stood slowly, met her eyes, saw something in them he couldn't read, couldn't interpret through the twisted mess the bond had become. "I didn't come here to take your crown," she said. Her voice carried across the battlefield clear enough for every wolf present to hear. "I came here to force you to see what you'd become, to show you that power without purpose is just slow suicide dressed up as strength." "Then why the demand? Why make me think you were betraying me exactly the same way I betrayed you? Because you needed to know what it feels like, to have someone you trust use your vulnerability as a weapon, to stand there completely powerless while they take everything you value, to feel your world ending and know there's nothing you can do to stop it." Lucien felt something crack in his chest. Not the bond. Something deeper. Something that had been holding him together through sheer stubborn will. Understanding. This whole thing was a test. Not a test. A mirror. Seraphina stepped closer, close enough that he could feel her breath, see the exhaustion in her eyes that matched his own, see the pain she was carrying that probably matched his too. "You spent 4 months learning what the rejection cost you, But you never understood what it cost me, what it's like to be completely powerless while someone destroys you and calls it politics. So you wanted me to feel it firsthand. I wanted you to understand that power isn't strength, that the ability to hurt someone doesn't make you worthy of ruling them. That real leadership requires understanding what it's like to be on the receiving end of consequences. She placed her hand over his heart, right where the bond mark had faded to a scar. The connection exploded between them. Years of damage and 4 months of rot and all the pain they'd caused each other, crystallizing into something almost unbearable. I don't want your crown, Lucien. I never did. Power for its own sake is exactly what destroyed you in the first place. I want you to be worthy of wearing it, to understand what leadership actually means. How? Tell me how and I'll do it. Tell me what I need to become. By remembering this moment, by never forgetting what powerlessness feels like, by building an empire where no one has to stand in a throne room being destroyed by someone who's supposed to protect them, by ruling like someone who understands that the wolves you govern are people, not pieces on a board. Lucien stared at her, at the woman who'd just torn him apart and somehow put him back together differently, at the mate who'd survived his rejection and become something stronger than he'd ever imagined possible. The empire needs a queen, he said quietly, someone who understands suffering, someone who knows what it's like to be discarded and forgotten and counted as worthless. Someone strong enough to fix what I broke while I was too obsessed with maintaining control. Are you asking or telling? I'm begging. Genuinely. No manipulation, no angle, just begging you to help me build something better than what we have. Seraphina looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the armies surrounding them, at Veilor watching with cautious hope written across his scarred face, at the Moonfang warriors who'd followed her into battle, at Malakar's surrendered forces waiting to see who would rule them and how brutal the retribution would be. Here are my terms, she said. Her voice carried authority that made every wolf present stand straighter instinctively. We rule together, equal power, equal authority, equal voice in every decision. You handle military strategy and external security. I handle internal reforms and village support and fixing the corruption. Neither of us makes major decisions without the other's explicit agreement. And the bond? What happens with us? We fix it slowly, carefully. No more breaking things because we're scared. No more destroying each other because it's easier than being vulnerable. No more choosing power over people. I can do that. I swear I can. Can you? Because the moment you reject me again, the moment you choose power or pride or politics over us, I'm gone. Permanently. And I'm taking half the empire with me when I leave. I won't. I swear on every ghost I've accumulated, on every mistake I've made, on every wolf who died because I was too broken to lead properly, I won't make that mistake again. Seraphina studied him, looking for the lie, looking for the angle, looking for the manipulation that had to be hiding somewhere beneath the apparent sincerity, finding only exhaustion and desperate honesty and something that might actually be love if they could both survive long enough to figure out what that meant. Fine, she said finally. We try. But I'm not promising forgiveness. I'm not promising the bond will heal completely. I'm promising effort, the rest we earn day by actually doing the work. She turned to address the assembled armies. Duke Malakar, step forward now. Movement rippled through the surrendered forces. Malakar emerged looking significantly less smug than he had at dawn. Blood on his expensive armor, defeat in his calculating eyes, the look of a man who'd gambled everything and lost spectacularly. You have a choice, Seraphina said. Her voice carried across the battlefield like a blade cutting through fog. Swear loyalty to this new arrangement and keep your lands under heavy oversight and constant auditing, or refuse and face public execution for treason against the crown. Choose quickly, because my patience is limited. Malakar looked at Lucien, at Seraphina, at the Moonfang warriors who'd shattered his carefully planned coup, at the reality that he'd lost and they'd won. I swear loyalty, he said. The words came out bitter, defeated, poisonous. To both crowns, to the new arrangement. Good. You're now personally responsible for rebuilding every village your tax collectors destroyed or damaged. You'll use your personal fortune, your family's assets, everything you've stolen over the years. If you refuse or try to circumvent this order, I'll have you executed publicly and creatively. Understood perfectly? Understood. Seraphina looked at the other noble houses present, representatives who'd supported Malachar or stayed neutral, wolves who'd been calculating which side would win before committing. The same choice applies to all of you. Swear loyalty to reform and help fix what you broke, or face consequences that will be both creative and permanent. Decide now. One by one, the nobles swore. Some willingly because they saw which way the wind was blowing. Some through gritted teeth because they had no other choice. But all of them understood that the empire had just changed fundamentally and irrevocably. Valor approached slowly. His weathered face showed something that might have been pride mixed with relief. Your Majesty, Your Grace, what are your orders for the forces? Lucien looked at Seraphina. She nodded once. Equal partners making decisions together. We return to the capital, Lucien said. His voice carried renewed strength. We execute anyone who refuses the new terms. We redistribute all seized assets to damaged villages. We audit every noble house thoroughly. We build the empire we should have built from the very start instead of maintaining the broken system we inherited. And we do it together, Seraphina added, or we don't do it at all. The armies began moving, packing up, preparing for the march back to Raventhorn Palace. Wolves who'd been enemies hours ago now working side by side because their leaders had forced a different path forward. Lucien stood beside Seraphina watching the organized chaos. The bond between them still ached, still carried 4 months of damage that wouldn't heal quickly or easily. But it was alive, functional, no longer actively rotting them from the inside out. I'm sorry, he said quietly, for everything, for being too terrified to see what I had, for choosing power over you, for destroying you in that throne room, for all of it. I know you are. Seraphina didn't look at him, kept watching the armies prepare to move. Sorry doesn't fix it, but it's a start. It's acknowledgement. It's the foundation we build from. What do I do now? How do I prove I've actually changed instead of just saying pretty words? You already started. You knelt in front of both armies, offered to give up everything, fought me honestly instead of trying to manipulate the situation. That's more vulnerability and honesty than most kings show in a lifetime. It wasn't enough. No, but it was real. And reality is what we build from instead of pretty lies. They stood together in silence, two broken alphas trying to figure out how to rule an empire while fixing themselves simultaneously, trying to build something better from the ruins of what they'd destroyed. Behind them, sudden commotion erupted near the edge of the battlefield. Shouting, the sound of weapons being drawn rapidly, wolves scattering in panic and confusion. Lucien's hand went to his sword automatically. Seraphina moved beside him in perfect sync, the bond between them suddenly alert, sharp. Warning of danger approaching fast. Valor ran toward them through the chaos. His face carried an expression Lucien had only seen a handful of times. The expression that said everything they'd just fought for was about to be tested by something neither of them had anticipated or prepared for. Your Majesty, Your Grace. We have a significant situation developing. What kind of situation? The kind that makes everything we just accomplished meaningless if we can't handle it. 3 riders came through the scattered armies at full speed, not soldiers from either force, not nobles playing games, messengers wearing the distinctive colors of the Eastern territories, the kingdoms beyond the empire's borders that had been watching Lucien's descent into madness with calculating interest and patient opportunism. The lead messenger stopped his exhausted horse before Lucien and Seraphina, bowed formally despite obvious urgency, delivered news that turned their hard-won victory into ash and smoke. Your Majesties, the Eastern Coalition has formally declared war on the Empire. They're claiming the realm is fatally weakened by internal conflict and unstable leadership. Their combined armies are already crossing the border in 3 locations simultaneously. Intelligence reports estimate 50,000 wolves minimum, possibly significantly more. They'll reach the capital within 2 weeks if we can't stop them. The messenger paused. Let the full weight of that information sink in like poison. They're demanding complete and unconditional surrender, immediate annexation of all imperial territories, where they've sworn to burn every city to the ground and salt the earth behind them so nothing grows for generations. Lucien felt the victory slip through his fingers like water through cracks. They'd survived the coup, survived each other. put the empire back together through sheer stubborn will and desperate compromise. Now external enemies were coming to finish what Malachar had started. He looked at Seraphina, saw the same rapid calculation in her eyes, saw her doing the brutal math. Exhausted forces who'd just fought a battle, depleted resources, noble houses barely held together by threats and promises, an empire that had been tearing itself apart for months, against 50,000 fresh troops led by kings who'd been planning this invasion for months or years, who'd been waiting for exactly this moment of weakness. The odds were catastrophically worse than what they'd just survived, possibly impossible even with everything they had. Seraphina's hand found his without hesitation, their fingers intertwined. The bond pulsed once, strong, clear, shared understanding passing between them without needing words. They'd fought each other and somehow survived. Now they'd fight together against impossible odds, or die trying to protect what they'd built. Lucien looked at Valor, at the armies slowly realizing what was coming, at the nobles who'd just sworn loyalty, probably reconsidering their oaths and calculating whether surrender might be smarter than fighting. How long do we actually have before they reach us? 2 weeks maximum, Valor said grimly. Maybe less if they force march, or if our intelligence is wrong about their speed. Then we have 2 weeks to prepare. 2 weeks to turn exhausted wolves into an army capable of defending everything we just fought for. 2 weeks to prove that this new arrangement can actually survive contact with reality. He looked at Seraphina, at his mate, his equal, his partner in whatever came next. You wanted to fix the empire together. Here's your first real test. Can we hold what we've built against enemies who want to burn it all down and dance in the ashes? Seraphina's silver eyes hardened. The healer who'd stood broken in a throne room 4 months ago was gone completely and permanently. What remained was a queen forged in rejection and survival, and 4 months of learning exactly how strong she actually was when survival demanded it. We hold, she said. Her voice carried across the battlefield with absolute unshakable certainty. Or we die trying. The armies erupted in coordinated motion, soldiers mobilizing despite exhaustion, wounded being treated so they could fight again, supplies being organized and rationed, every wolf present understanding that the real war was just beginning. And Lucien stood beside his mate with the crown he'd almost lost, and an empire held together by desperate hope and barely healed wounds, facing odds that should have been completely impossible. But impossible was what they did now. 2 broken alphas who'd torn each other apart and somehow found a way to fight together instead of destroying each other. The eastern armies were coming like a storm that had been building for years, and Raventhorn Palace stood directly in their path with 2 weeks to prepare for annihilation. 2 weeks was not enough time to prepare for annihilation, but it was all they had. Lucien stood on the walls of Raventhorn Palace, watching the sun rise over an empire that had 14 days left to prove it deserved to survive. Beside him, Seraphina studied maps and troop movements with the focused intensity of someone who understood that every decision from this moment forward meant life or death for thousands. The bond between them hummed steadily now. Not healed, not whole, but functional. A connection they were learning to use instead of letting it use them. Valor approached with fresh intelligence reports. His face carried the exhaustion of a man who hadn't slept in days and wouldn't sleep again until this was over or they were all dead. The eastern armies are moving faster than expected. 10 days now, maybe less. Then we work faster, Lucien's voice carried across the fortifications. What's our current strength? 12,000 wolves fit to fight. Another 3,000 wounded who can hold a wall but not charge. The Moonfang clan adds another 8,000. Duke Malachar and the noble houses who swore loyalty bring maybe 6,000 more, if we can trust them not to switch sides the moment things look bad. 29,000 total against 50,000 minimum. Lucien did the math. Odds that made survival look like wishful thinking. Numbers don't tell the whole story, Seraphina said quietly. She looked up from the maps. Her silver eyes caught the dawn light. The eastern forces are spread across 3 invasion points. They're counting on us being too weak and divided to defend everywhere simultaneously, so we don't defend everywhere. We choose one point and hit it with everything we have. Exactly. Force them to consolidate. Make them fight on ground we choose instead of letting them dictate terms. Lucien looked at her, at the mate who 4 months ago had been a healer with no military training. Now she was reading tactical situations like she'd been born to warfare. Leadership isn't about knowing everything, she said, reading his expression. It's about surrounding yourself with people who know what you don't and actually listening to them. A lesson he'd learned far too late. The next 10 days became a blur of preparation that felt simultaneously frantic and inadequate. They fortified the northern approach, where the terrain offered defensive advantages, evacuated villages in the invasion path, and brought the civilians behind palace walls, trained exhausted soldiers in defensive formations they'd need when outnumbered 2-1, stockpiled weapons and medical supplies, and tried to prepare for casualties that would be catastrophic, no matter how well they fought. And through it all, Lucien and Seraphina ruled together. Not perfectly. They argued about strategy, disagreed on which noble houses to trust, fought over how much mercy to show versus how much strength to project. But they argued as equals, as partners who'd learned that disagreement didn't mean betrayal. On the 5th day, Duke Malachar requested an audience. Lucien wanted to refuse, wanted to tell the man who'd tried to murder him to go to hell. But Seraphina convinced him otherwise. If we're asking the Empire to change, we have to prove we mean it. That includes giving people chances to become better than they were. They met Malachar in the war room. The Duke looked diminished somehow, less confident. The coup's failure had stripped away his certainty that he knew better than everyone else. Your Majesties, I come with information that may prove useful. Speak. Lucien's voice carried no warmth. The Eastern armies are led by King Aldrich of the Shadowfen territories. I've dealt with him before. He's ruthless but pragmatic. If we can prove the Empire is stable and unified, he might accept terms that don't involve total annihilation, or he might see negotiation as weakness and push harder. Seraphina studied Malachar carefully. Why are you telling us this? What do you gain? The Duke was quiet for a moment. Because I've spent my entire life playing political games and accumulating power. And in the end, when your armies were at my throat, all that power meant nothing. I'd like to die knowing I did at least one thing that mattered instead of just serving myself. Lucien wanted to distrust the words, wanted to see manipulation and angles. But he recognized the exhaustion in Malachar's voice, the bone-deep weariness of someone who'd finally seen themselves clearly and hated what they found. We'll consider your counsel, but Malachar, if you betray us during the battle, I'll make sure your death takes days. Understood, Your Majesty. After the Duke left, Seraphina looked at Lucien. You believe him? I believe he's terrified enough to be honest. Fear makes people show their true selves. The question is whether his true self is someone we can trust or just someone who's good at pretending. On the 8th day, scouts reported the Eastern armies consolidating. All 3 invasion forces were merging into one massive column, exactly as Seraphina had predicted. They're coming straight at us, Valor said. No subtlety, no divided forces, just overwhelming numbers aimed at breaking us in one decisive battle. Then we meet them in the Ironwood Valley. Lucien traced the map, narrow enough that their numbers matter less. Defensible terrain forces them to come at us through choke points. It also means no retreat if things go wrong. We commit everything and either win or die there. Lucien looked at Seraphina, saw his own understanding reflected in her eyes. This was it, the moment that would define whether the empire they'd tried to build could survive reality. We commit everything, Seraphina said. Her voice was steady. We fight there, and we make it count. The night before the battle, Lucien couldn't sleep. He walked the palace halls visiting troops, talking to soldiers who would die tomorrow, defending an empire that had failed them repeatedly. Young wolves barely old enough to fight, veterans who'd survived too many wars already. They all looked at him differently now, not with the fear they'd shown before, with something that might have been hope, might have been trust, might have been the belief that their king actually cared whether they lived or died. Lucien found Seraphina in what had become her chambers. She stood at the window looking north toward where the battle would happen, toward where thousands would die regardless of who won. Can't sleep either? She asked without turning. Too much to think about, like the fact that we might all be dead this time tomorrow. That's part of it. She turned to face him. The moonlight caught her silver eyes and made them glow. 4 months ago, she'd been terrified standing in his throne room. Now she looked like someone who'd walked through fire and come out forged instead of burned. I need you to promise me something, she said quietly. Anything. If I die tomorrow, you don't let it break you the way losing your mother broke your father. You keep ruling. Keep building what we started. Don't let my death be the excuse you use to become a monster." Lucien felt his throat tighten. "And if I die? What do you do?" "I rule alone. I finish what we started. I make sure every wolf who dies tomorrow dies for something real instead of just political games." She crossed to him, placed her hand over his heart where the bond mark had scarred. "We've been broken and barely put back together. The bond still hurts most days. I still wake up remembering what you did in that throne room, but I'd rather fight beside you tomorrow and die as your partner than live alone regretting that we never tried." "I love you," Lucien said. The words came easier now. "I love you, and I'm sorry I was too terrified to see that 4 months ago." "I know." Seraphina's voice was soft. "And I'm starting to believe you might actually mean it." They stood together in the darkness, two broken people who'd somehow found a way to be stronger together than they'd ever been apart. Tomorrow, they'd find out if that was enough. Dawn came cold and gray. The armies assembled in Ironwood Valley with grim efficiency. 29,000 wolves against an enemy that outnumbered them by 20,000 at minimum. Defensive positions established. Archers on high ground, reserves ready to plug gaps in the line. Everything they could do with limited time and resources. It wouldn't be enough, but it would have to be. The eastern armies appeared on the horizon like a storm. 50,000 wolves in perfect formation. Banners of a dozen kingdoms united by the promise of conquest and plunder. King Aldrich rode at the front on a massive warhorse, his armor gleaming even in gray light. He stopped just outside arrow range and called out, "Lucien Drakar, king of a broken empire held together by desperation. I offer you one final chance to surrender with honor." Lucien rode forward with Seraphina beside him. Equals presenting a united front. "Define honor," he called back. "You abdicate. The empire becomes a protectorate of the Eastern Coalition. Your people are spared the worst of the occupation if they don't resist. You and your mate live in comfortable exile. And if we refuse, then we take everything by force. Kill everyone who resists. Burn the cities. Take the survivors as slaves. Your choice is whether the empire dies quickly with some dignity or slowly with maximum suffering." Lucien looked at the massive army behind Aldrich, looked at his own outnumbered forces. Did the math one final time. Some choices aren't actually choices. He looked at Seraphina. She nodded once. "Here's our counter-offer," Lucien shouted. "You turn your armies around and leave. In exchange, we won't make you regret testing us." Aldrich laughed. Genuine amusement. "You're outnumbered almost 2-1. Your empire has been tearing itself apart for months. You have no leverage, no hope of victory. And you're threatening me? No. I'm promising you. Because the difference between your army and mine is that your wolves are here for conquest and plunder. Mine are here protecting their homes. And wolves defending their homes fight harder than wolves chasing easy victory." Noble words. Let's see if they're worth the blood they'll cost. Aldrich turned his horse. "Prepare to attack." The eastern armies surged forward like a flood. What followed was not a battle. It was systematic slaughter, attempting to be dressed up as warfare. The eastern forces hit the defensive lines with overwhelming weight. Wolves died in the first clash, hundreds. Lines buckled. Positions that were supposed to hold for hours collapsed in minutes. Lucien fought in the center where the pressure was worst. Seraphina commanded the reserves, moving reinforcements to plug gaps before they became catastrophic. Vylor led the veterans in holding the flanks, but numbers mattered. For every eastern wolf that fell, 2 more pressed forward. For every position they held, another collapsed somewhere else. This wasn't a battle they could win through skill or tactics or determination. This was mathematics written in blood. 2 hours into the fighting, Lucien found himself surrounded by enemy wolves. His own forces cut off. Bleeding from a dozen wounds, his wolf screaming for him to shift and tear throats until nothing was left standing. A massive eastern alpha broke through his guard, claws aimed for his throat. Lucien barely deflected, felt ribs crack from the impact. The alpha grinned. Press the advantage. "This is where it ends, false king." Then Seraphina was there. She hit the eastern alpha from the side with enough force to shatter bones. They went down together in a tangle of claws and fury. She came up first, drove her blade through his throat without hesitation, pulled Lucien to his feet. "Stay with me. We're not dying here." Her eyes blazed with determination that bordered on madness. The healer who'd trembled in a throne room was gone completely. What remained was a warrior queen who refused to accept defeat. They fought back to back, bond pulsing between them, using the connection to anticipate each other's movements, becoming something more effective together than they'd ever been apart. But it wasn't enough. All around them, Imperial forces were falling back, not retreating, just dying. The Eastern armies pressed forward relentlessly. This was how it ended. Outnumbered, outmatched, dying well, but dying nonetheless. Then the horizon behind the Eastern armies exploded with movement, not reinforcements for the enemy. Reinforcements for the Empire. Thousands of wolves poured over the hills, not soldiers, not trained warriors, just wolves from the villages Lucien and Seraphina had been trying to protect. Farmers and craftsmen and healers, the forgotten people who'd suffered under decades of corrupt rule. They'd come to fight for the Empire that had finally started to care whether they lived or died. The Eastern armies suddenly found themselves surrounded, caught between Imperial forces in front and enraged civilians behind. The mathematics shifted violently. King Aldrich screamed orders. His forces tried to adjust, tried to fight in two directions simultaneously, but the moment had turned. The Empire's wolves fought with renewed desperation. The civilians fought with rage at decades of suffering. The Eastern armies fought with growing panic as victory turned to potential disaster. What should have been a massacre became a genuine battle. Lucien found King Aldrich in the chaos. The Eastern king fought like the veteran warrior he was, but he was alone, cut off from his generals, surrounded by enemies. Their eyes met across blood-soaked ground. "This didn't have to happen," Aldrich said. His voice was tired. "We could have negotiated, could have found terms that let both empires survive. You demanded total surrender. That's not negotiation. Because your empire was dying. I was offering mercy. No. You were offering slavery dressed up as protection." Lucien circled him slowly, both of them bleeding, both exhausted. There's a difference between accepting help and accepting chains. They charged simultaneously. The fight was brutal and short. Both alphas operating on fumes, trading strikes that would have been lethal hours ago but now barely connected. Pain and exhaustion making every movement agony. Lucien's blade found Aldrich's chest. Not a killing blow, but enough to drop the Eastern king to his knees. "Yield," Lucien said. "Call retreat. End this before more wolves die for pride." Aldrich looked at him with eyes that held acknowledgement of defeat. "You won. Take your victory." "I don't want victory. I want peace. Withdraw your armies. We'll negotiate actual terms, trade agreements, mutual defense, things that benefit both empires instead of just conquering and pillaging." "Why would you offer terms after winning?" "Because I've learned that breaking people doesn't make you strong. It just makes you the kind of king who has to sleep with weapons close and trust no one." Aldrich studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Call the retreat." The Eastern armies withdrew in organized chaos, not routed, not shattered, but clearly defeated and no longer willing to pay the cost. Imperial forces didn't pursue, didn't press the advantage, just held the ground they'd bled for and watched their enemies leave. It wasn't the decisive victory that made for good stories, but it was the kind of victory that let both sides survive. The aftermath took days to process. 5,000 Imperial wolves dead, another 7,000 wounded. The Eastern forces had lost twice that many. The valley reeked of blood and death and consequences. Lucien walked among the wounded with Seraphina beside him, thanking soldiers, promising support for families who'd lost fathers and sons and daughters, trying to remember every name and face. These wolves had saved the Empire, had fought and bled and died for the idea that things could be better. He owed them more than he could ever repay. A young soldier, barely 20, caught his arm. "Your Majesty, was it worth it? Did we actually change anything?" Lucien knelt beside him. The soldier had lost a leg, would never fight again, would carry this battle in his body forever. "I don't know yet," Lucien said honestly. "We stopped the invasion. We proved the Empire can survive when we fight together instead of tearing each other apart. But whether we actually build something better from this, whether we honor your sacrifice by becoming worthy of it, That's going to take years to answer. But you're going to try? You and the Queen? We're going to try. Every day. Until we get it right or die trying. The soldier nodded, closed his eyes. That's enough. Just needed to know it mattered. Seraphina found him hours later sitting alone in the ruins of what had been a defensive position, surrounded by evidence of how close they'd come to total annihilation. You should be celebrating. We won. Did we? Lucien gestured at the battlefield. Thousands dead. An empire barely held together. External enemies who'll be back once they recover. I'm not sure this counts as winning. We're alive. The empire survived. That's more than we had any right to expect 2 weeks ago. She sat beside him, their shoulders touched. The bond between them hummed steadily. I keep thinking about that soldier, the one who asked if it mattered. And what did you tell him? That we're going to try. That's all anyone can promise. Seraphina looked at him with silver eyes that had seen the worst of what leadership cost. Then we try. We rebuild villages. We reform taxes. We hold nobles accountable. We create the empire where healers don't get rejected for being lowborn and soldiers don't die wondering if their sacrifices meant anything. And us? What happens with us? We figure it out day by day. The bond is still damaged. I still wake up some mornings remembering what you did. But I also remember you kneeling in front of both armies. Remember you offering to give up everything. Remember you fighting beside me when it would have been easier to run. That's enough? For now. Ask me again in a year when we've actually had time to heal instead of just surviving crisis to crisis. Lucien took her hand, felt the bond pulse between them. Still twisted, still scarred, but alive and getting stronger slowly. I don't deserve you. No, you don't, but you're trying to become someone who does. That's what matters. 3 months after the battle, Raventhorn Palace looked different. Not the structure itself, but the atmosphere. The suffocating weight of fear and dominance had lifted slightly, replaced by something that might actually be hope. Lucien and Seraphina ruled together from side-by-side thrones, not one above the other, equal in height and authority, a physical representation of partnership instead of hierarchy. The reforms they'd promised were actually happening, slowly, imperfectly, with constant resistance from nobles who wanted things to stay comfortably corrupt, but happening. Villages received support instead of just demands. Corrupt officials faced real consequences. The forgotten wolves who'd saved the empire at Ironwood Valley found themselves with voices that mattered. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than what came before. On the anniversary of the rejection, Lucien stood in the throne room where he'd destroyed Seraphina 4 months before everything changed. She stood beside him. No longer the terrified healer, a queen who'd been forged in rejection and had emerged stronger than anyone expected. A year ago I stood here and made the worst mistake of my life, Lucien said quietly. I rejected you because I was terrified that loving you would make me weak, like my father. And now I know that weakness isn't loving someone. Weakness is being too terrified to try, too proud to admit mistakes, too broken to believe things can heal. He turned to face her fully, took both her hands. I'm not asking you to forgive me completely. I know I don't deserve that yet. But I'm asking if you'll keep trying with me. Keep building this empire together. Keep teaching me how to be worthy of you. Seraphina looked at him with eyes that held everything they'd survived together. All the pain and blood and desperate choices. The bond still hurts sometimes. I still have nightmares about standing in this room being destroyed while nobles laughed. I know. But I also dream about fighting beside you. About building something better than what we inherited, about proving that broken things can be put back together if you're willing to do the actual work. She stepped closer, close enough that the bond blazed between them. So yes, I'll keep trying. Not because you've earned complete forgiveness, because I want to see what we can become if we both keep choosing each other instead of choosing power. Lucien pulled her close, felt the bond settle into something almost comfortable, not healed completely, but functional. Strong enough to build on. I love you. I know. Seraphina's voice was soft, and I'm starting to love you back. The version of you that's trying to be better, not the king who broke me. I'll take that. They stood together in the throne room where everything had started, where a terrified king had chosen power over love and nearly destroyed everything worth protecting. But that was then. Now was different. Now they ruled together, fixed the empire together, learned together how to be worthy of the wolves who'd bled to give them a second chance. Outside the palace, the empire continued its slow transformation. Villages rebuilt. Families healed. The forgotten wolves discovered they mattered. It wasn't the empire that songs celebrated, but it was the empire that actually worked. And in the obsidian halls of Raventhorn Palace, two broken alphas who'd destroyed each other and somehow found their way back proved something that most kings never learned. Real strength isn't dominating everyone around you. It's being vulnerable enough to let someone see your worst parts, and strong enough to become better when they show you what you've become. The mate bond between them glowed silver against their skin. Not perfect, not complete, but alive and getting stronger every day they chose each other instead of choosing pride. And across the empire they'd nearly lost, wolves told a different story about their alpha king, not about the territories he conquered or the enemies he crushed, about the queen he rejected, and the man he had to become to earn her back. Some called it weakness that he'd knelt before her, but the wolves who'd fought at Ironwood Valley knew the truth. The strongest thing a king can do is admit he was wrong and actually change instead of just apologizing. Lucien and Seraphina stood together on the palace walls watching the sun set over their imperfect empire. No more running from the bond. No more choosing power over people. Just two wolves who'd been broken and had learned to heal together, building something better from the ruins of what they destroyed. One day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of earned trust at a time, and that was enough.